There is a photograph from November of 2010. The confetti is still falling, the champagne is still dripping from his fire suit, and the man at the center of it all, standing on the pit wall at Homestead Miami Speedway, with his arms stretched wide and his face tilted toward the Florida sky, looks like a man who has just done the impossible, because he has 5 consecutive NASCAR Cup Series championships. 5 straight years at the top of the most competitive form of motorsport in America. No driver in the modern era of the sport had ever done it before. No driver has done it since. And on that warm November evening in South Florida, with the lights of the speedway cutting through the gathering dusk and the roar of 100,000 voices rattling the grandstands, Jimmie Johnson stood alone at the summit of a mountain that no one else had ever climbed. 5 in a row. The phrase sounds simple, 3 words, but inside those 3 words lives a story of relentless preparation, extraordinary talent, and a consistency so profound that it forced the sport to rewrite its understanding of what dominance looks like. Other drivers have won more races in a single season. Other drivers have won more championships over the course of a career. But no one, in the entire history of NASCAR's Premier Series, has ever achieved what Jimmie Johnson achieved between 2006 and 2010. 5 consecutive titles. 5 seasons in which, when the final checkered flag fell and the final points were tallied, one man stood above every other driver in the field, the same man, every single year, for half a decade. The numbers are almost clinical in their reliance on the word dominance. During that 5-year stretch, Johnson won 35 races. He finished in the top 5 101 times. He finished in the top 10 144 times out of 180 starts. He led more laps, earned more points, and accumulated more victories than any other driver in the sport over that period. He did not merely win championships. He accumulated them with a mechanical precision that made the rest of the field look like they were racing for second place. And yet, for all of that dominance, Jimmie Johnson was never the most popular driver in NASCAR. He was never the fan favorite. He was never the one whose name was chanted in the grandstands or whose merchandise outsold everyone else at the souvenir trailers. He was respected, certainly. He was admired by those who understood the depth of his achievement. But he was not loved, not in the way that Dale Earnhardt was loved, or Jeff Gordon, or Dale Earnhardt Jr. There was something about Jimmie Johnson, something about the quiet, methodical way he went about his business that made it difficult for the casual fan to connect with him on an emotional level. He was too consistent, too calm, too professional. He made winning look easy, and in a sport that celebrates drama and struggle and the raw edge of human emotion, making it look easy was, paradoxically, the one thing the fans could not forgive. This is the contradiction at the heart of the Jimmie Johnson story. The greatest sustained run of excellence in the history of the sport, achieved by a man whom the sport never quite knew how to celebrate, a champion so dominant that he altered the very structure of the championship format, and yet so understated that many fans struggled to explain why his achievement should rank alongside the legends of the past. A driver whose record commands reverence, but whose personality seemed designed to deflect attention, to redirect the spotlight toward his team, his crew chief, his car, anything and anyone other than himself. There are those who argue that Jimmie Johnson is the greatest NASCAR driver who ever lived. There are those who argue that his success was primarily the product of his equipment, his team, and his crew chief, the legendary Chad Knaus. There are those who place him alongside Richard Petty and Dale Earnhardt, and Jeff Gordon in the sport's Mount Rushmore. And there are those who believe that the era in which he competed, with its emphasis on consistency over raw speed, somehow diminishes his accomplishments. The debate has raged for more than a decade, and it shows no sign of being resolved. What is not debatable is the record. 7 Cup Series championships, tying him with Richard Petty and Dale Earnhardt for the most in history. 83 career victories, 222 top 5 finishes, 374 top 10 finishes in 686 career starts, 2 Daytona 500 victories, and the crown jewel, the achievement that belongs to him and him alone, The 5 consecutive championships that rewrote the record books and forced the entire sport to reconsider what was possible. This is the story of how a kid from El Cajon, California, a kid who grew up riding dirt bikes in the desert and dreaming of off-road racing glory, ended up becoming the most consistent champion in the history of stock car racing. It is a story of unlikely beginnings and improbable partnerships, of a driver and a crew chief whose combination of talent and temperament produced results that neither could have achieved alone. It is a story of quiet greatness, of excellence that was so steady and so reliable that it became invisible, overlooked, not because it was ordinary, but because it was so extraordinary that it ceased to be surprising. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand why 5 in a row matters more than any single season of dominance. You are going to understand the man behind the helmet, the preparation behind the performance, and the partnership that made it all possible. You are going to understand why Jimmie Johnson's place in the history of NASCAR is secure, regardless of whether the fans loved him, hated him, or simply could not figure out what to make of him. And you are going to understand the deeper truth, the one that the statistics alone cannot tell, about what it costs to be the best for 5 straight years in the most physically and mentally demanding form of motorsport on the planet. Before we get started, if you find these stories as moving as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more people who appreciate the legends of the game. Now, let us begin. To understand the era in which Jimmie Johnson rose to greatness, you must first understand the era that preceded it. And the era that preceded it was defined, more than anything else, by death. Stock car racing has always been a dangerous sport. From the very beginning, from the first informal races on the sand at Daytona Beach and the rutted dirt tracks of the Carolina Piedmont, the men who climbed into these machines understood that they were accepting a bargain with fate. Speed was the currency, risk was the price, and for decades, the sport treated the loss of its participants as an unavoidable cost of doing business, a tragic but ultimately acceptable consequence of the pursuit of velocity. Drivers died, the sport mourned, and then the engines fired again the following week, because that was what racers did. They raced. The earliest years of NASCAR were marked by a casualty rate that, viewed from the perspective of the modern era, seems almost incomprehensible. The cars were poorly protected. The roll cages were minimal, little more than a few bars of steel welded together in configurations that offered some structural support but could not withstand the forces generated by a high-speed impact. The seats were modified production seats, bolted to the floor with hardware that was never designed for the stresses of racing. The restraint systems were primitive, often consisting of nothing more than a lap belt that held the driver in the seat, but did nothing to protect his head and neck from the violent deceleration of a crash. The tracks themselves were hazards. The guardrails, where they existed at all, were rigid steel barriers that absorbed none of the energy of an impact, transferring the full force of the collision directly into the car and the driver's body. The walls were concrete or steel, unforgiving surfaces that turned even moderate speed impacts into potentially fatal events. The runoff areas were minimal or non-existent. The medical facilities at most tracks were rudimentary, staffed by volunteers with limited training and limited equipment. A driver who was seriously injured in a crash at a NASCAR race in the 1950s or 1960s was, in many cases, entirely at the mercy of chance and geography, his survival, depending as much on how quickly he could be transported to a hospital as on the severity of his injuries. The names of the drivers who lost their lives in those early decades form a long and somber roll call. Some are remembered, many are not. They were young men and old men, veterans and rookies, champions and backmarkers. They died on the straightaways and in the turns, on the superspeedways and the short tracks, in qualifying sessions and in races and in practice. They died because the cars were not safe enough, because the tracks were not safe enough, because the sport had not yet developed the technology or the will to protect its participants from the consequences of their courage. Billy Wade died at Daytona in January of 1964 during a tire test. Joe Weatherly, the former champion, was killed at Riverside International Raceway that same month when his car struck the retaining wall. Fireball Roberts, one of the sport's biggest stars, was fatally burned in a crash at Charlotte Motor Speedway in May of 1964, dying from his injuries 6 weeks later. These were not obscure figures. They were prominent, celebrated drivers whose deaths should have served as a wake-up call to the sport, and to some degree, they did. Improvements were made. Roll cages were strengthened. Fuel cells were introduced to reduce the risk of fire. But the improvements were incremental, reactive rather than proactive, always trailing behind the increasing speeds of the cars rather than anticipating them. The pattern repeated itself through the 1970s and 1980s. The cars got faster. The speeds climbed. The forces involved in crashes grew more severe. And the safety equipment, while improving, never quite kept pace. The restrictor plates introduced at Daytona and Talladega in 1988 reduced the top speeds at those tracks, but also created a style of racing, pack racing, that introduced its own unique dangers. When 40 or more cars are running nose to tail at nearly 200 miles per hour, separated by inches, the potential for a multi-car accident is enormous. And when those accidents happened, the results were often catastrophic. The superspeedway crashes of the late 1980s and 1990s were some of the most violent in the history of the sport. Cars went airborne, tumbling end over end, disintegrating in showers of debris that endangered not just the drivers, but the spectators in the grandstands. At the 1987 Winston 500 at Talladega, Bobby Allison's car went airborne after a tire failure, flying into the catch fence that separates the track from the grandstands. The impact tore a massive hole in the fence, and only by the narrowest of margins were the spectators behind it spared from injury. The incident prompted NASCAR to mandate restrictor plates at Daytona and Talladega, a decision that reduced speeds but also fundamentally altered the character of racing at those tracks. The death of Neil Bonnet at Daytona in February of 1994 during a practice session was another stark reminder of the sport's danger. Bonnet, a popular and talented driver who had been attempting a comeback after a series of severe crashes, was killed when his car struck the wall in Turn 4. Just days later, Rodney Orr, a young driver making his Daytona debut, was killed in a crash during a practice session at the same track. 2 deaths in the same week, at the same track, in the same month. The sport was shaken, but the response, as always, was to mourn and then to move on. The mid-1990s saw the speeds continue to climb. The cars of the Cup Series were producing in excess of 750 horsepower, and on the superspeedways, even with restrictor plates, the closing speeds between cars could exceed 220 miles per hour. The forces generated in a crash at those speeds were enormous, far beyond what the safety equipment of the era was designed to handle. The helmets were better than they had been in the 1960s, but they were not designed to protect against the rotational forces that could cause fatal brain injuries. The seatbelts were stronger, but they did not prevent the head and neck from snapping forward in a frontal impacts, a motion that could fracture the base of the skull. The HANS device, a head and neck support system that prevented exactly this type of injury, had been developed by Dr. Robert Hubbard and his brother-in-law Jim Downing in the early 1980s. The device worked by tethering the helmet to the shoulder harness, preventing the head from snapping forward in a crash while still allowing normal range of motion during driving. It was simple, effective, and had been proven in testing to dramatically reduce the risk of basilar skull fractures. But it was not widely adopted in NASCAR. Many drivers resisted wearing it, citing discomfort or restricted movement. The sanctioning body did not mandate its use, and the result was that the technology that could have saved lives was available but was not being used. The turn of the millennium brought a cluster of tragedies that would finally force the sport to confront the safety crisis with the urgency it demanded. In the year 2000, 3 drivers lost their lives in NASCAR-related incidents within a span of months. Adam Petty, the 19-year-old grandson of Richard Petty and the 4th generation of the Petty family to race in NASCAR, was killed during a practice session at New Hampshire Motor Speedway on May the 12th. Kenny Irwin Jr., a talented young driver with a promising career ahead of him, was killed at the same track in the same turn, just weeks later on July the 7th. Tony Roper, a veteran Truck Series driver, was killed in a crash at Texas Motor Speedway on October the 13th. 3 deaths in 1 year. 3 reminders that the sport's safety had not kept pace with its speed. And then came February the 18th, 2001. The Daytona 500, the biggest race of the year. The event that drew the largest audience and generated the most attention of any race on the NASCAR calendar. On the final lap, on the last turn of the last lap of the Great American Race, Dale Earnhardt's black number 3 Chevrolet struck the outside wall. The impact appeared relatively mild by the standards of superspeedway crashes. There was no fire, there was no prolonged tumble. The car struck the wall at an angle, slid down the banking, and came to rest in the infield grass. But Dale Earnhardt, the 7-time champion, the Intimidator, the man who had been the living embodiment of stock car racing for more than 2 decades, was dead. He was 49 years old. The impact of Earnhardt's death on the sport cannot be overstated. This was not a fringe figure or a backmarker. This was the most famous, most popular, most iconic driver in the history of NASCAR, a man whose face was as recognizable in America as that of any professional athlete. His death was not just a personal tragedy for his family and his team. It was a crisis for the sport itself, a moment that forced NASCAR to confront, finally and irrevocably, the fact that its approach to safety was inadequate, that drivers were dying because the sport had not done enough to protect them, and that the incremental, reactive approach to safety improvement that had characterized the previous 5 decades was no longer acceptable. The response was swift, comprehensive, and transformative. NASCAR mandated the use of the hands device for all drivers, effective immediately. The sanctioning body invested millions of dollars in the development and installation of safer barriers, steel and foam energy reduction barriers, at tracks across the country. These barriers, designed to absorb and dissipate the energy of an impact rather than reflecting it back into the car, represented a fundamental rethinking of track safety. They were installed first at Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and then gradually at every major NASCAR track, replacing the rigid concrete and steel walls that had been responsible for so many injuries and deaths. The cars themselves were redesigned with safety as a primary consideration. The cockpit safety cells were reinforced and strengthened. The seats were redesigned to provide better support and better energy absorption. The window nets were upgraded. The roof flaps, designed to prevent cars from going airborne, were improved. The fuel cells were enhanced. Every component of the car that could affect driver safety was scrutinized, tested, and improved in a systematic effort to close the gap between the speeds the cars were capable of and the protection the drivers received. The medical response capabilities at the tracks were also dramatically upgraded. NASCAR invested in state-of-the-art medical facilities at every Cup Series venue, staffed by trained trauma physicians and equipped with the technology needed to provide immediate, life-saving care to a driver who had been injured in a crash. The response times were reduced. The protocols were standardized. The entire medical infrastructure of the sport was brought into alignment with the best practices of modern emergency medicine. The cumulative effect of these changes was profound. In the years following Earnhardt's death and the safety revolution it triggered, the rate of serious injuries and fatalities in NASCAR declined dramatically. Drivers survived crashes that would have been fatal in earlier eras. The safer barriers absorbed impacts that would have killed or seriously injured drivers who struck rigid walls. The hands device prevented the basilar skull fractures that had claimed the lives of Earnhardt, Adam Petty, Kenny Irwin, and others. The sport was still dangerous, still demanding, still capable of producing crashes of spectacular violence. But the likelihood of a driver being killed or permanently injured in one of those crashes was dramatically reduced. This was the world that Jimmie Johnson entered when he arrived in the Cup Series. He made his first full-time start in 2002, just 1 year after Earnhardt's death. He arrived in a sport that was still grieving, still processing the loss of its greatest icon, still grappling with the realization that its approach to safety had been fundamentally inadequate. He arrived at a moment of transformation, when the old ways were being replaced by new protocols, new technologies, and new attitudes about the relationship between speed and safety. Johnson benefited from these changes in ways that are impossible to quantify, but impossible to ignore. The safer barriers that protected him in crashes that might have ended his career in an earlier era. The hands device that protected his head and neck in impacts that would have been potentially fatal without it. The improved medical response capabilities that ensured he would receive world-class care in the event of a serious injury. The safer cars, the better seats, the stronger cockpits. All of these things allowed Johnson to pursue his extraordinary career with a level of protection that his predecessors could only have dreamed of. But the safety revolution also shaped the competitive landscape in which Johnson competed. The emphasis on consistency and risk management that characterized the chase format, introduced in 2004, was in part a response to the safety concerns that Earnhardt's death had raised. The sport was looking for ways to reduce the incentive for reckless driving, to reward the teams that could perform at a high level over the course of an entire season, rather than those that took enormous risks in pursuit of individual race victories. This emphasis on consistency aligned perfectly with Johnson's strengths as a driver, with his methodical approach to competition, his ability to manage a race rather than simply attacking it, and his talent for extracting the maximum result from every situation. The safety improvements also enabled a level of physical durability that was essential to Johnson's sustained success. A driver who is injured in a crash, even a crash that does not result in a serious injury, is compromised. The bruises, the strains, the lingering effects of even a minor impact accumulate over the course of a season and can erode a driver's performance in ways that are subtle but significant. By reducing the severity of the impacts that drivers experienced, the safety revolution allowed Johnson to compete at peak physical condition week after week, season after season, for the better part of 2 decades. The dark history of racing deaths, the long and painful evolution from a sport that accepted fatalities as inevitable to a sport that devoted enormous resources to preventing them, is the foundation upon which Jimmie Johnson's career was built. He raced in an era that was made possible by the sacrifices of the drivers who came before him, the men who died, because the sport had not yet learned how to protect them. Their loss was the catalyst for the changes that created the environment in which Johnson's greatness could unfold. This is not to diminish Johnson's achievement. It is to contextualize it, to place it within the broader arc of a sport that has always been engaged in a struggle between the desire for speed and the need for safety. Every great champion of every era has been shaped by the conditions of that era, and Johnson was no different. He was a product of the safety revolution, a champion who emerged from the wreckage of tragedy, and who competed in a sport that had been transformed by its own grief. The story that follows is the story of how that champion was made. It begins not on the high-banked superspeedways of the South, but in the desert hills of Southern California, where a young boy with a dirt bike and a dream of speed was about to begin a journey that would carry him to the very top of American motorsport. It is a story of improbable beginnings, unlikely partnerships, and a level of sustained excellence that the sport had never seen before and may never see again. The safer barrier technology that emerged from the post-Earnhardt safety revolution deserves particular attention, because it represents one of the most significant engineering achievements in the history of the sport. The barriers, developed by a team at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, led by Dr. Dean Sicking, consisted of steel tubes backed by foam panels that were mounted on the existing concrete walls. When a car struck the safer barrier, the steel tubes deflected inward, compressing the foam and absorbing a significant portion of the impact energy before it could reach the car and the driver. The reduction in the peak deceleration forces experienced by the driver was dramatic, often reducing the severity of an impact by more than 50% compared to a direct strike on a rigid concrete wall. The installation of safer barriers at tracks across the country was not instantaneous. It required significant investment from the track operators, and the logistics of installing the barriers at tracks with varying configurations and wall designs were complex. But the commitment was real, and over the course of the 2000s, Virtually every Cup Series track was equipped with safer barriers at the locations where impacts were most common and most severe. The result was a racing environment that was measurably safer than anything the sport had previously known, an environment in which drivers could push the limits of their cars with the confidence that the infrastructure around them was designed to protect them in the event of a crash. The evolution of the cars during this period was equally significant. The car of tomorrow, introduced in 2007, represented a fundamental rethinking of stock car design with safety as a primary consideration. The car featured a larger cockpit, a reinforced driver's side door, a rear wing that replaced the traditional deck lid spoiler, and a front splitter that improved aerodynamic consistency. The design was controversial among drivers and fans, with many criticizing the car's appearance and its handling characteristics. But the safety improvements were undeniable, and the car of tomorrow survived impacts that would have been catastrophic in earlier generations of stock cars. The helmet technology advanced in parallel with the car design. Modern NASCAR helmets are carbon fiber shells equipped with impact-absorbing liners, integrated radio communication systems, and forced air ventilation that keeps the driver cool and provides a clean air supply in the event of a fire. The helmets are tested to withstand impacts far more severe than anything a driver is likely to experience in a crash, and they represent a quantum leap in head protection compared to the helmets worn by drivers in the 1960s and 1970s. The fire suppression systems in the cars were another critical safety improvement. Modern Cup Series cars are equipped with onboard fire suppression systems that can be activated by the driver or by the safety crew in the event of a fire. The fuel cells, which contain the car's fuel supply in a flexible, impact-resistant bladder, are designed to prevent fuel leakage in a crash, dramatically reducing the risk of the kind of catastrophic fuel-fed fires that had killed and maimed drivers in earlier eras. Each of these improvements, taken individually, represented an incremental advance in the sport's safety profile. Taken together, they represented a revolution, a fundamental transformation in the relationship between speed and safety that made the modern era of NASCAR the safest in the sport's history. The drivers who competed in this era, Jimmie Johnson among them, benefited from the accumulated wisdom of decades of tragedy and innovation, racing in cars that were stronger, on tracks that were more forgiving, with equipment that was more protective than anything their predecessors had known. But the safety revolution did not make racing safe, it made it safer. The distinction is important. Stock car racing remains an inherently dangerous activity. The speeds are enormous. The forces involved in a crash are immense. The proximity of the cars to each other and to the walls creates conditions in which a momentary lapse in concentration or a mechanical failure can result in an impact of devastating violence. The safety improvements have reduced the likelihood of fatal and serious injuries, but they have not eliminated the risk entirely. Every driver who straps into a Cup Series car knows this. Every driver who takes the green flag accepts this. And every driver who competes at the highest level of the sport does so with the understanding that the margin between triumph and tragedy, while wider than it once was, has not been eliminated. The generation of drivers that includes Jimmie Johnson was the first to benefit fully from the safety revolution that followed Earnhardt's death. They competed in an environment where the lessons of the past had been translated into concrete improvements in the cars, the tracks, the equipment, and the medical response capabilities. They raced with a level of protection that their predecessors could only have imagined, and this protection allowed them to push the limits of their talent and their courage with a confidence that was historically unprecedented. This is the context in which Jimmie Johnson's 5 consecutive championships must be understood. He was not racing in a vacuum. He was racing in a sport that had been transformed by tragedy, a sport that had looked unflinchingly at the cost of its own pursuit of speed and had committed itself to reducing that cost without sacrificing the competitive intensity that made the sport worth watching. The safety revolution did not make Johnson's championships easier, it made them possible. It created the conditions in which a driver could compete at the highest level for 2 decades without suffering the kind of career-ending or life-ending injury that had claimed so many of his predecessors. The debt that the modern era owes to the drivers who were lost, to Adam Petty and Kenny Irwin and Tony Roper and Dale Earnhardt and all the others whose deaths drove the safety revolution forward, is a debt that can never be fully repaid, but it can be honoured. And the greatest honour that the modern drivers can offer is to compete with everything they have, to push themselves and their machines to the absolute limit, and to demonstrate, through the quality and the intensity of their racing, that the sacrifices of those who came before were not made in vain. Jimmie Johnson, through his extraordinary career, honoured that sacrifice as fully and as completely as any driver of his generation. The cultural impact of the safety revolution extended beyond the physical changes to the cars and the tracks. It also changed the way drivers, teams, and the sanctioning body thought about risk. In the decades before Earnhardt's death, the prevailing attitude towards safety in the NASCAR garage was one of acceptance. Crashes were part of the sport. Injuries were part of the deal. Drivers who expressed concern about safety were sometimes viewed as soft, as lacking the competitive toughness that the sport demanded. The macho culture of the garage, rooted in the sport's working-class origins and its moonshine-running mythology, did not leave much room for conversations about vulnerability and protection. Earnhardt's death shattered that culture. The loss of the toughest, most fearless driver in the sport demonstrated, with a finality that could not be argued away, that bravery alone was not enough to protect a driver from the physics of a high-speed impact. The conversations about safety that followed were honest, urgent, and devoid of the bravado that had previously characterized the topic. Drivers who had resisted the hands device now wore it willingly. Teams that had treated safety as an afterthought began incorporating it into their core engineering processes. The sanctioning body, which had been criticized for its reactive approach to safety, became proactive, investing in research and development, and mandating improvements before tragedies occurred rather than in response to them. This cultural shift was as important as the technological improvements. It created an environment in which safety was not seen as the enemy of competition, but as its essential complement. A sport that protects its participants is a sport that can sustain itself across generations. A sport that does not protect its participants is a sport that will eventually consume itself. NASCAR, in the aftermath of Earnhardt's death, chose the former path, and the result was a sport that was safer, more sustainable, and ultimately more competitive than it had ever been. The drivers who entered the sport in the wake of this transformation, Jimmie Johnson among them, inherited a racing environment that was shaped by the lessons of the past. They did not experience the era of routine fatalities and cavalier attitudes towards safety. They competed in a sport that valued their lives and invested in their protection, and this allowed them to focus their attention and their energy on the pursuit of excellence, secure in the knowledge that the sport was doing everything in its power to bring them home safely at the end of every race. The convergence of the safety revolution and the chase format created a competitive environment that was uniquely suited to a driver of Jimmie Johnson's temperament and skill set. The emphasis on consistency, the rewards for sustained performance, the penalties for high-risk mistakes, all of these elements aligned with Johnson's natural approach to competition. He was a driver who thrived on precision, on preparation, on the methodical accumulation of advantages that compounded over the course of a season. The post-Earnhardt era of NASCAR, with its emphasis on safety and consistency, was the perfect stage for his particular brand of greatness. The medical advances of the era deserve one final note. The infield care centers at modern NASCAR tracks are equipped with diagnostic imaging equipment, trauma surgery capabilities, and life-flight helicopter access that would have seemed like science fiction to the drivers and track operators of the 1960s. The response protocols have been refined through years of practice and study, and the time between an accident and the delivery of advanced medical care has been reduced to minutes, rather than the hours that might have elapsed in earlier decades. A driver who is injured in a crash at a modern Cup Series event receives a level of care that rivals what is available at a metropolitan trauma center and this capability has saved lives and prevented permanent injuries on multiple occasions. The sum total of these advances, the barriers, the cars, the helmets, the fire systems, the medical facilities, the cultural shift in attitudes towards safety, represents the most comprehensive safety transformation in the history of any major professional sport. And the era that this transformation created was the era in which Jimmie Johnson built his legacy. The story that follows is the story of how a young man from the California desert took the opportunities that this safer, more competitive era provided and transformed them into the most remarkable sustained championship run the sport has ever seen. It is a story that begins not with a crash or a funeral or a moment of grief, but with a boy on a dirt bike kicking up dust in the hills east of San Diego, chasing speed for the pure, uncomplicated joy of it. That boy would grow into a man who chased speed with the same joy, but with a discipline and a focus that elevated the pursuit from recreation to art. And the art he created, measured in championships and victories, and the quiet accumulation of excellence over more than 2 decades of competition, would stand as one of the greatest achievements in the history of American motorsport. Jimmie Kenneth Johnson was born on September 17, 1975, in El Cajon, California, a city nestled in a valley east of San Diego, surrounded by the dry, scrub-covered hills that define the landscape of Southern California's inland region. El Cajon was not a racing town in the traditional sense. It was not part of the stock car belt that stretched from the Carolinas through Virginia and Tennessee and Georgia. It was not home to the kind of dirt tracks and short ovals that produced the generation of NASCAR drivers who preceded Johnson. It was, instead, the kind of place where a boy grew up riding dirt bikes and four-wheelers in the desert, where speed meant kicking up rooster tails of dust on unmarked trails, where the connection to motorsport was measured not in oval laps, but in miles of open terrain. Johnson's father, Gary, was a heavy equipment operator. His mother, Kathy, worked in various capacities to help support the family. They were a working-class family in a working-class town, and the values they instilled in their son, hard work, humility, respect for others, and a willingness to earn everything you receive, would shape the way Jimmie Johnson approached his career and his life for decades to come. The boy was drawn to anything with an engine from the time he could walk. By the age of 4, he was riding a motorcycle, wobbling down dirt paths under the watchful eye of his father. By 5, he was racing competitively in motocross events, the organized off-road motorcycle races that are a staple of Southern California's motorsport culture. By 8, he had graduated to off-road racing in small buggies, the lightweight, open-wheel vehicles that tear through the desert at alarming speeds over terrain that would destroy a conventional automobile. Off-road racing was Johnson's first love, and it shaped his driving style in ways that would prove profoundly valuable when he eventually transitioned to stock cars. The desert demanded adaptability. The terrain was never the same twice. Rocks shifted, sand drifted, ruts appeared and disappeared with the weather. A driver who excelled in the desert had to process information in real time, constantly adjusting his inputs to match the changing conditions beneath his wheels. There was no time for deliberation. The decisions came fast and instinctive, a continuous flow of micro-adjustments that kept the vehicle on the edge of control without ever crossing over into disaster. This skill, the ability to adapt instantly to changing conditions, would become one of Jimmie Johnson's defining characteristics as a stock car driver. In a sport where track conditions evolve constantly over the course of a race, where the grip level changes with temperature and tire wear, and the accumulation of rubber on the racing surface, the ability to feel those changes and respond to them intuitively is the difference between a good driver and a great one. Johnson developed that feel in the desert, thousands of miles from the nearest stock car track, in a form of racing that most NASCAR fans had never heard of. As he moved through his teenage years, Johnson progressed through the ranks of off-road racing with a speed that reflected both his talent and his dedication. He competed in the Mickey Thompson Entertainment Group series, a premier off-road racing organization, and won championships in several classes. He drove stadium trucks, the powerful short-course off-road vehicles that race on temporary courses built inside football and baseball stadiums. He competed in the SCORE International Off-Road Series, including the legendary Baja 1000, the grueling 1,000-mile race through the desert of Mexico's Baja California Peninsula that is considered one of the most demanding endurance events in all of motorsport. But somewhere along the way, Johnson's ambitions shifted. The off-road world, as exciting and as challenging as it was, offered limited opportunities for a full-time professional career. The sponsorship money was modest, the television exposure was minimal, the path to financial stability and long-term career viability was narrow and uncertain. Johnson began to look toward other forms of racing, forms that offered larger audiences, bigger sponsorships, and a clearer pathway to the kind of career that could sustain him for decades. His first step onto the oval was in the American Speed Association, or ASA, a Midwestern-based stock car series that served as a training ground for aspiring NASCAR drivers. The transition from off-road to oval racing was not seamless. The two disciplines are fundamentally different in almost every respect. Off-road racing rewards improvisation and brute force durability. Oval racing rewards precision, consistency, and the ability to run at the absolute limit of adhesion for hundreds of laps without making a mistake. The cars handle differently. The racing surface is different. The competitive dynamics are different. Everything is different. Johnson struggled initially in the ASA, as any driver would when adapting to a radically new discipline. But the same qualities that had made him successful in the desert, the adaptability, the work ethic, the willingness to learn, carried him through the transition period. He began to win races, he began to attract attention, and he began to climb the ladder that would eventually lead him to the highest level of American stock car racing. In 1998, Johnson moved to the NASCAR Busch Series, the second tier of stock car competition, driving for the Herzog Motorsports team. His Busch Series career was respectable but not spectacular, a period of continued learning and development during which he refined his oval racing skills against higher quality competition. He showed flashes of speed and talent, but the results were inconsistent, and the big breakthrough that would catapult him to the Cup Series had not yet arrived. The breakthrough came in a conversation, an introduction that would change the trajectory of his career and, ultimately, the trajectory of the sport. Jeff Gordon, the four-time Cup Series champion and the biggest star in NASCAR, was looking for a young driver to recommend to Rick Hendrick, the owner of Hendrick Motorsports, one of the most successful teams in the history of the sport. Gordon had been watching Johnson race in the Busch Series, and he saw something in the young Californian that reminded him of his own early days. The talent was obvious. The work ethic was evident, but there was something else, something harder to define. A quietness of demeanor, a calm under pressure, a sense that this young man processed the world at a different speed than those around him, that he was always thinking, always analyzing, always looking for the next edge. Gordon recommended Johnson to Hendrick, and the team owner agreed to give the young driver a chance. In 2001, Johnson ran a partial schedule of Cup Series races for Hendrick Motorsports, making his debut at the fall race at Charlotte Motor Speedway. He performed well enough to earn a full-time ride for the 2002 season, driving the number 48 Chevrolet with sponsorship from Lowe's, the home improvement retailer. The assignment of Chad Knaus as Johnson's crew chief was the decision that set everything in motion. Knaus was a young, intense, fiercely intelligent mechanic from Rockford, Illinois, who had worked his way up through the Hendrick organization with a relentless drive and an exacting attention to detail that made him both respected and feared within the team. He was not easy to work with. He was demanding, uncompromising, and possessed of a perfectionism that could be both inspiring and exhausting. He pushed the boundaries of the rulebook with an aggressiveness that occasionally got the team into trouble with the sanctioning body. He was, in short, a force of nature, and the question was whether Jimmie Johnson, with his laid-back California demeanor, could coexist with a crew chief whose intensity bordered on the obsessive. The answer, as the world would soon discover, was yes. The Johnson-Knaus partnership would become the most successful driver-crew-chief combination in the modern history of NASCAR, a collaboration that produced 7 Cup Series championships and 83 victories over a period that spanned nearly 2 decades. But the success was not immediate, and the partnership was not without its tensions. The two men were, in many ways, opposites. Johnson was calm, personable, and inclined to see the positive in every situation. Knaus was intense, demanding, and inclined to see every imperfection as a problem that needed to be fixed immediately. Johnson was the good cop. Knaus was the relentless perfectionist who pushed the entire team to meet standards that sometimes seemed impossible. But the tension between their personalities was, paradoxically, the source of their strength. Johnson's calm kept Knaus from burning out the team with his intensity. Knaus's intensity kept Johnson from becoming complacent with results that were merely good when great was within reach. They complemented each other in a way that neither could have anticipated. And the partnership produced a competitive machine that was, for a sustained period, the most formidable operation in the sport. Johnson's rookie season in 2002 was a revelation. He won 3 races and finished 5th in the championship standings, an extraordinary result for a first-year driver and a performance that announced to the garage area that the number 48 team was going to be a force for years to come. He followed that with another strong season in 2003, winning 3 more races and finishing 2nd in the points standings. In 2004, the first year of the chase format, he won 8 races and finished 2nd in the championship to Kurt Busch by just 8 points, one of the narrowest championship margins in the sport's history. The near miss in 2004 was agonizing, but it was also instructive. Johnson and Knaus studied the championship run that had fallen just short, analyzed every decision and every result, and identified the areas where they could improve. The relentless self-examination that characterized the Knaus approach to competition was never more evident than in the off-season following the 2004 season, when the entire team was subjected to a comprehensive review of its processes, its strategies, and its execution. Nothing was taken for granted. Nothing was assumed to be good enough. Every aspect of the operation was scrutinized with the goal of finding the additional margin that would carry the team from championship contender to championship winner. In 2005, Johnson won 4 races and finished 5th in the standings, a solid season but not the championship that the team was seeking. The results were strong, but the consistency required to win a championship under the chase format remained elusive. The chase format rewarded sustained performance over the final 10 races of the season, and Johnson's tendency to have occasional off weekends during the chase cost him in the overall standings. And it gets harder when you consider the pressure that was building. By 2005, Johnson had been in the Cup Series for 4 full seasons. He had won races. He had contended for championships. He had established himself as one of the top drivers in the sport, but he had not won a title. The question, whispered in the garage area and debated in the media, was whether Jimmie Johnson was a driver who could win races but not championships, a driver who had the speed but not the killer instinct, the talent but not the mental toughness to close the deal when it mattered most. Then 2006 arrived, and the answer to that question was delivered with a force and a clarity that left no room for doubt. The 2006 season was the beginning of the streak, the first of the 5 consecutive championships that would define Johnson's legacy. He won 5 races during the regular season, positioning himself as a strong contender for the chase. When the 10-race playoff began, Johnson and Knaus executed with a precision that was almost frightening. The number 48 car was not always the fastest car in the field during those 10 races. It did not need to be. It needed to be consistently among the fastest, and it was. Johnson finished in the top 10 in 9 of the 10 chase races. He managed the points. He avoided the crashes. He maximized the results on days when the car was not perfect. And when the final race at Homestead Miami Speedway was complete, Johnson was the champion by a margin of 56 points over Matt Kenseth. The celebration was muted by Johnson's own standards. He was not a man given to extravagant displays of emotion. He smiled. He thanked his team. He acknowledged the accomplishment with the same quiet grace that characterized everything he did. There were no fist pumps, no chest-thumping proclamations, no boastful declarations about his place in history. He had won his first championship. He was grateful. and he was already thinking about the next one. The 2007 season was, in many ways, even more impressive than 2006. Johnson won 10 races, the most prolific single-season total of his career. He dominated the regular season and then carried that momentum into the chase with a relentlessness that left his competitors grasping for answers. He won 4 of the 10 chase races, a level of performance that made the championship feel almost inevitable. He clinched his second consecutive title with a margin of 77 points over Jeff Gordon, his mentor, his teammate, and one of the greatest drivers in the history of the sport, 2 in a row. The achievement was significant, but it was not historically unprecedented. Other drivers had won consecutive championships before. Cale Yarborough had won 3 in a row from 1976 through 1978. Dale Earnhardt had won 2 consecutive titles on multiple occasions. Jeff Gordon had won back-to-back championships in 1997 and 1998. Winning 2 straight was impressive. It was not yet the stuff of legend. The 2008 season changed the narrative. Johnson won 7 races and claimed his 3rd consecutive championship, matching Yarborough's record of 3 in a row from the 1970s. The comparison to Yarborough was inevitable, and it invited a deeper examination of what Johnson was achieving. Yarborough's three-peat had come during an era of dramatically different rules, different competition levels, and different championship formats. Johnson's three-peat was achieved in the chase era, against a field that was more competitive, more professionally organised, and more deeply talented than anything Yarborough had faced. The equivalency was debatable, but the magnitude of the achievement was not. 3 consecutive championships, under any set of conditions, placed Jimmie Johnson among the very elite of the sport's history. But here is what makes this story unforgettable. Johnson did not stop at 3. The 2009 season, his 4th championship year, was a masterclass in the art of championship racing. He won 7 races and navigated the chase with the same relentless consistency that had characterized his previous title runs. By this point, the narrative had shifted from admiration to something approaching disbelief. 4 in a row. It was a feat that no driver in the modern era had ever accomplished. It was a feat that most observers had considered impossible under the chase format, which was specifically designed to create competitive drama and prevent any single team from dominating the championship for consecutive years. And yet here was Jimmie Johnson, winning his 4th straight title, as if the format had been designed specifically to showcase his particular strengths. The 2010 season, the 5th consecutive championship, was the pinnacle. Johnson won 6 races during the regular season, and then executed the chase with the same precision that had become his signature. The margins were tighter than in previous years. The competition pushed him harder. There were moments during the chase when it seemed possible that the streak might end, when other drivers threatened to disrupt the pattern of dominance that had characterized the previous 4 seasons. But Johnson and Knaus, drawing on the experience and the confidence that 4 consecutive championships had built, navigated every challenge with a composure that bordered on the supernatural. When the final race at Homestead, Miami was complete and the 5th consecutive championship was secured, the accomplishment finally received the recognition it deserved. The statistics were staggering. 5 consecutive championships, 35 victories during the streak, an average finish inside the top 10 for the majority of the races he had entered. A consistency so profound that it redefined the concept of dominance in the sport. And yet, even as the record books were rewritten, there was a strange sense of understatement to the celebration. The fans cheered, but not with the fervour that had greeted Earnhardt's championships or Gordon's titles. The media covered the story, but without the breathless excitement that had accompanied other historic achievements in the sport. Johnson himself accepted the trophy with the same quiet dignity that had characterized his entire career, thanking his team, thanking his sponsors, thanking his family, and deflecting the attention away from himself with a humility that was both admirable and, in a way, frustrating. The greatest sustained run of excellence in the history of the sport was being achieved by a man who seemed almost embarrassed by his own greatness. The reasons for this disconnect between achievement and celebration are complex and revealing. Part of it was Johnson's personality, which was warm and genuine, but lacked the dramatic flair that the sport and its media ecosystem craved. Part of it was the Chad Knaus factor, the lingering suspicion among some fans and competitors that the team's success owed more to the crew chief's rule-bending ingenuity than to the driver's talent. Part of it was the nature of the chase format itself, which compressed the championship battle into a 10-race sprint that sometimes felt more like an exercise in point management than a test of raw racing ability. And part of it was the simple, unavoidable reality that sustained excellence, no matter how remarkable, eventually becomes routine. When a man wins the championship 5 years in a row, the 5th title does not produce the same thrill as the first. The extraordinary has become the expected, and the expected, by definition, cannot surprise. The relationship between driver and crew chief in NASCAR is unlike any partnership in professional sport. It is part engineer and pilot, part coach and quarterback, part conductor and first violin. The crew chief designs the instrument, the driver plays it, and the quality of the music they produce together depends on the depth of their communication, the precision of their collaboration, and the mutual trust that allows each man to do his job with confidence that the other is doing his. The Johnson-Knaus partnership exemplified this dynamic at its highest level. Knaus was a student of the car in a way that bordered on the obsessive. He understood the aerodynamics, the suspension geometry, the tyre behavior, the engine management, and the pit strategy with a comprehensiveness that made him one of the most formidable crew chiefs in the history of the sport. He did not merely prepare a fast car. He prepared a smart car, a car that was set up to perform optimally, not just on the first lap but on the 300th, a car that was designed to gain advantage over the competition, not through raw speed alone, but through a combination of speed, handling, and strategic flexibility that allowed the team to adapt to changing conditions during the race. Johnson, for his part, was the perfect instrument for Knaus's engineering vision. His driving style was smooth, precise, and easy on the equipment, a style that minimized tire degradation and fuel consumption while maximizing speed through the corners. His ability to communicate the car's behavior to Knaus over the radio was exceptional, using a vocabulary of sensations and descriptions that the crew chief could translate into specific adjustments. When Johnson said the car was a little tight entering turn 3, Knaus knew exactly what that meant in terms of the front suspension geometry and the air pressure in the right rear tire, and he could prescribe the adjustment that would correct the problem with surgical precision. The communication between them was so refined that it often seemed like a private language, a shorthand of technical terms and shared experience that excluded anyone who had not been part of their collaboration from the beginning. This intimacy of communication was a competitive advantage that no other team could replicate because it was not the product of a system or a process. It was the product of years of working together, of thousands of hours of shared experience on the track and in the shop, of a relationship that had been tested and strengthened by both success and adversity. The early years of the partnership, from 2002 through 2005, were a period of calibration and growth. Johnson and Knaus were learning each other, figuring out how to combine their strengths and manage their weaknesses. Knaus's intensity could be overwhelming, and there were moments early in the partnership when Johnson felt crushed by the weight of his crew chief's expectations. Knaus could be brutal in his criticism, dissecting a race performance with a candor that left little room for ego or self-congratulation. A third-place finish that Johnson might have considered respectable could trigger a 20-minute debrief in which Knaus catalogued every mistake, every missed opportunity, every fraction of a second that had been left on the table. Johnson's response to this pressure was to absorb it, to process Knaus's criticism without taking it personally, to understand that the crew chief's demands were not expressions of dissatisfaction with the driver, but expressions of a shared commitment to excellence that would accept nothing less than the absolute best. This emotional intelligence, this ability to separate the message from the messenger, and to extract value from even the harshest feedback, was one of Johnson's most important qualities, and it was essential to the longevity and the success of the partnership. By 2004, the calibration phase was complete. Johnson and Knaus were operating as a fully integrated unit, each man understanding the other's tendencies and capabilities with an intimacy that allowed them to make decisions in real time during races without the need for lengthy discussions or debates. The near-miss championship that year, decided by just 8 points, was agonizing, but it also demonstrated that the team was operating at a level that was among the very best in the sport. The gap between where they were and where they needed to be was tiny, and both men understood that closing that gap was a matter of refining their existing approach, rather than reinventing it. The off-season analysis that followed the 2004 championship loss was characteristic of the Knaus methodology. Every aspect of the season was reviewed, every race was dissected, every decision was examined for potential improvement. The team's pit crew performance was benchmarked against the best in the sport. The car's setup notebook, the comprehensive record of the adjustments made at every track, was scrutinized for patterns and opportunities. The driver's performance was analyzed lap by lap, with data acquisition telling a story of speed and consistency that complemented the subjective feedback Johnson provided. This level of self-examination was not unique to the Johnson-Knaus team. All competitive Cup Series teams conducted off-season reviews, but the thoroughness and the honesty of the Johnson-Knaus process set it apart. There were no sacred cows, no assumptions that went unchallenged, no decisions that were considered above scrutiny. The goal was improvement, relentless and continuous, and the process for achieving it was as systematic and as rigorous as anything in professional sport. The results of this process were evident in the 2006 season, when Johnson finally broke through to his first championship. The team that showed up at the opening race in 2006 was a refined version of the team that had narrowly missed the title in 2004, sharpened and polished by 2 additional years of development and refinement. The car was faster, the pit stops were quicker, the strategy was more precise, and the driver was more confident, more experienced, and more attuned to the rhythms and the demands of a championship campaign. The first championship changed everything. It validated the approach. It confirmed the partnership. It silenced, at least temporarily, the doubters who had questioned whether Johnson had the ability to close the deal in a championship battle. And it established a template for success that the team would follow, with variations and refinements for the next 4 years. The 2007 season elevated the template to new heights. 10 victories represented the most prolific winning season of Johnson's career, and the manner in which those victories were achieved demonstrated the full range of his abilities. He won on superspeedways, where the racing was pack-based, and the outcome often depended on positioning and timing rather than raw speed. He won on intermediate ovals, where the balance between aerodynamic performance and mechanical grip was the central challenge. He won on short tracks, where physical endurance and patience were tested over 500 laps of grinding, body-on-body competition. The versatility of his performance confirmed that the 2006 championship was not a fluke, but the beginning of something far more significant. The chase performance that year was devastating in its efficiency. Johnson won 4 of the 10 chase races, a rate of success that would have been impressive in any context, but was almost unprecedented in the high-stakes, high-pressure environment of the championship playoff. The margin of victory over Jeff Gordon, his own teammate and mentor, was 77 points, a gap that suggested the outcome had never really been in doubt. The third championship in 2008 was the one that elevated the conversation from remarkable to historic. 3 consecutive titles matched the record set by Cale Yarborough in the 1970s, a record that many had considered unbreakable in the modern era. The competition that year from Carl Edwards, who won 9 races and pushed Johnson to the limit throughout the chase, added drama and legitimacy to the achievement. Johnson did not win the third title by default or by the weakness of his competition. He won it against a challenger who was faster on many weekends, a challenger who would have been a worthy champion in any other season. But Johnson was more consistent, more disciplined, and more capable of maximizing his results over the full 10-race playoff. That consistency, That ability to turn good days into great days and great days into championships was the quality that separated him from every other driver in the field. The narrative weight of the fourth and fifth championships has already been described, but there is an emotional dimension to those final two titles that deserves further exploration. By 2009, the streak had become the central storyline of the Cup Series season. Every race was viewed through the lens of the championship, and every Johnson performance was analysed for its implications for the ongoing streak. The pressure was unlike anything Johnson had experienced in his career. He was not just trying to win a championship, he was trying to make history, to accomplish something that had never been done before, and that everyone around him knew might never be done again. The psychological burden of that pressure was enormous. Johnson dealt with it by doing what he had always done, by focusing on the process rather than the outcome, by trusting his preparation and his partnership with Knaus, by taking each race as it came and refusing to let the weight of the historical moment crush his ability to compete in the present. His mental toughness during those final two championship seasons was perhaps the most impressive aspect of the entire streak. The ability to perform at the highest level while carrying the expectations of an entire sport on his shoulders required a psychological resilience that went far beyond what any statistical measure could capture. The transition from the chase era to the elimination-style playoff format in 2014 added yet another layer of complexity to Johnson's championship campaigns. The new format divided the 10-race playoff into 4 rounds, with a portion of the field eliminated after each round. The final round consisted of 4 drivers competing for the championship at a single race, where the highest finisher among the 4 would be crowned champion. The format was designed to create maximum drama and maximum uncertainty, rewarding bold, aggressive racing over the consistent, point-managing approach that Johnson and Knaus had perfected. Many observers expected the new format to end Johnson's championship dominance. The elimination rounds introduced a level of volatility that seemed fundamentally incompatible with the Johnson-Knaus methodology. A single bad race, a single crash, a single mechanical failure could eliminate a championship contender, regardless of how well they had performed over the rest of the season. The format seemed designed to reward the kind of risk-taking, win-at-all-costs approach that was the antithesis of Johnson's style. And yet Johnson adapted. He made the final round of the playoffs in 2013 under the older format, winning his 6th championship. And he won his 7th championship in 2016 under the new elimination format, demonstrating that his ability to compete at the highest level was not dependent on any particular set of rules or any particular championship structure. He was a champion in the truest and most complete sense, a driver who could win under any conditions, against any competition in any format the sport could devise. The 7th championship in 2016 was a fitting capstone to the Johnson-Knaus era. At 41 years of age, Johnson outperformed a field that included drivers who were a full generation younger than him, men who had grown up watching Johnson win championships and who had modelled their own approaches to competition on his example. The title was won at Homestead Miami Speedway, the same track where Johnson had clinched multiple championships during the 5-year streak, and the victory had a circular quality that gave it an emotional resonance beyond its statistical significance. He had begun his championship career at Homestead, and he reached its culmination at the same track, a decade of dominance, ended by the same stretch of South Florida asphalt. The years between 2017 and 2020, Johnson's final Cup Series seasons, were marked by a decline that was gradual but unmistakable. The wins stopped. The championship contention ended. The number 48 car, which had been a fixture at the front of the field for a decade and a half, was increasingly relegated to the middle and the back of the running order. The reasons for the decline were multiple and interrelated. The cars had changed, with the introduction of lower downforce aerodynamic packages that rewarded a different driving style than the one Johnson had perfected. The competition had intensified, with a new generation of drivers who had absorbed the lessons of the Johnson era and were applying them with their own innovations and adaptations. And Johnson himself, while still physically fit and mentally sharp, had lost the fractional edge of reaction time and sensory acuity that separates the champions from the contenders at the highest level of the sport. The end of the Knaus partnership after 2018 removed the final pillar of the structure that had supported Johnson's dominance. Knaus was reassigned within Hendrick Motorsports, and Johnson worked with substitute crew chiefs who were talented but who could not replicate the deep, intuitive connection that had been the foundation of the team's success. The results suffered accordingly, and the final 2 seasons of Johnson's Cup Series career were, by his standards, a disappointment. But here is what makes this story unforgettable. The decline does not diminish the achievement. If anything, it highlights it. It demonstrates that the 5-year streak and the 7 championships that surrounded it were not the product of equipment or circumstance alone. They were the product of a unique and unrepeatable combination of driver, crew chief, team, and competitive environment. When any element of that combination was altered, the results changed. But during the years when all of the elements were aligned, the results were nothing short of historic. The scope of what Johnson accomplished during his peak years becomes clearer when you place it against the full sweep of NASCAR history. Only 3 men have won 7 or more Cup Series championships, and all 3 did it under fundamentally different conditions. Richard Petty won his 7 titles across an era that stretched from the 1960s through the 1970s, in a sport that was regional in scope and modest in its competitive depth. Dale Earnhardt won his 7 titles across the 1980s and 1990s, in a sport that was growing rapidly but still operated within the traditional framework of full-season points accumulation. Johnson won his 7 titles in the 2000s and 2010s, in a sport that was fully national in scope, corporate in structure, and governed by a playoff format specifically designed to prevent any single team from achieving the kind of sustained dominance that Johnson achieved anyway. Each era presented its own unique challenges. Each champion overcame those challenges in his own way. But Johnson's task was in many respects the most difficult of the 3. The competitive depth of the Cup Series during his championship years was greater than it had ever been. The parity enforced by the rules package and the inspection process was tighter than it had ever been. The playoff format was more demanding and more volatile than any championship structure the sport had previously employed. And yet Johnson won. He won 5 in a row. He won 7 in total. He won with a consistency that made the most challenging championship format in the sport's history look like it had been tailored to his strengths. The truth gets heavier when you consider that Johnson accomplished all of this without the natural advantage of being raised in a racing family or emerging from the sport's traditional pipeline. He was not a Petty or an Earnhardt or an Allison born into the sport and groomed for it from childhood. He was a kid from the California suburbs who fell in love with speed on dirt bikes and off-road trucks, and who, through a combination of talent, determination, and fortunate connections, found his way to the pinnacle of American stock car racing. His journey was improbable, his achievement was extraordinary, and his legacy, however the fans and the critics choose to characterize it, is permanent. The first of the 5 consecutive championships, won in 2006, established the template that would carry Jimmie Johnson through the most dominant stretch in the modern history of the sport. But the championships were not won in a vacuum. They were won in the context of specific races, specific moments, specific challenges that tested Johnson and his team in ways that the final standings alone cannot capture. To understand the 5-year streak, you have to understand the individual battles that comprised it, the races that were won and lost, the decisions that were made under pressure, and the moments when the difference between a championship and a near-miss came down to the smallest of margins. The 2006 chase began at New Hampshire Motor Speedway in September, and from the very first race, Johnson and Knaus demonstrated the approach that would define their championship runs. They did not need to win. They needed to be consistently excellent, and consistently excellent was exactly what they were. Johnson finished 3rd at New Hampshire, a solid result that kept him within striking distance of the points lead. He followed that with a second-place finish at Dover and a fourth-place finish at Kansas. The results were not dramatic. They were not the kind of performances that generate headlines or highlight reels, but they were exactly the kind of performances that win championships. Steady, reliable, relentless accumulations of points that grind down the competition over the course of 10 races. The chase format, introduced in 2004, was designed to create a playoff-style atmosphere in the final third of the season. The top drivers in the standings after the first 26 races were reset to a nearly equal points total and then competed over the final 10 races for the championship. The format rewarded consistency above all else. A driver who finished in the top 5 every week would accumulate points at a rate that was almost impossible for a more erratic competitor to match, even if the erratic competitor won more individual races. Johnson understood this dynamic intuitively, and his ability to deliver top 5 and top 10 finishes week after week, regardless of whether the car was the fastest in the field, was the foundation of his championship success. The key race of the 2006 chase was at Martinsville Speedway, the flat, half-mile oval in Southern Virginia that is one of the most physically demanding tracks on the schedule. Johnson won the race, a result that gave him a comfortable points lead heading into the final races of the season. The victory at Martinsville was significant, not just for the points it provided, but for the message it sent to the rest of the field. Johnson could win at a track that rewarded patience and physical endurance as much as raw speed, a track where the best car did not always win and where the smartest driver often did. The Martinsville victory demonstrated that Johnson's consistency was not the product of caution or conservatism. It was the product of intelligence, of the ability to read a race and adapt his strategy to the specific demands of each track and each situation. The 2007 season brought a different set of challenges and a different set of defining moments. The 10-race victory total was the most impressive of Johnson's career, and several of those wins came at critical moments in the championship battle. The victory at Charlotte Motor Speedway in October during the chase was particularly significant. Charlotte is one of the marquee events on the schedule, and winning there during the chase required the team to perform at the highest level under intense competitive pressure. Johnson and Knaus delivered a dominant performance, leading the most laps and controlling the race from start to finish. But the defining moment of the 2007 chase was not a victory, it was a recovery. At the Talladega race, Johnson was involved in a multi-car crash that left his car heavily damaged. The team worked frantically on pit road to repair the car, and Johnson returned to the track to salvage a finish that, while far from ideal, was far better than the disaster it could have been. The ability to recover from adversity, to salvage points from a situation that appeared hopeless, was one of the hallmarks of the Johnson-Knaus partnership, and it was on display throughout the 2007 chase. The championship was won not just on the days when everything went right, but on the days when things went wrong, and the team found a way to minimize the damage. The numbers are striking when you examine the consistency of Johnson's chase performances across the 5-year streak. In the 50 chase races that comprise the 5 championship seasons, Johnson finished in the top 5 27 times, and in the top 10 39 times. He won 11 chase races. He finished outside the top 20 only 4 times. The consistency was not just impressive, it was unprecedented. No other driver in the chase era had demonstrated such a sustained ability to perform at the highest level during the playoff races, and the gap between Johnson and the rest of the field was, in many of those seasons, wider than the final points margins suggested. The Chad Knaus factor was a constant presence throughout the 5-year streak, and it was a source of both admiration and controversy. Knaus was a genius at car preparation, a man who understood the aerodynamics and the mechanical dynamics of a stock car with a depth of knowledge that rivaled anyone in the sport. But he was also a boundary pusher, a crew chief, who operated in the grey areas of the rulebook with an aggressiveness that repeatedly brought him into conflict with the sanctioning body. The most significant of these conflicts came before the 2006 Daytona 500, when Knaus was suspended by NASCAR for rules violations discovered during pre-race technical inspection. The car's rear window had been modified in a way that did not conform to the specifications mandated by the sanctioning body, a modification that could have provided an aerodynamic advantage. The penalty was severe. Knaus was suspended from the team for 4 races, fined a significant sum, and placed on probation. The incident raised uncomfortable questions about the integrity of the team's success. If Knaus was willing to push the rules at Daytona, where the inspections were the most rigorous on the schedule, what else might the team be doing at tracks where the scrutiny was less intense? Johnson and the team weathered the suspension, with substitute crew chief Darian Grubb stepping in during Knaus's absence and performing admirably. When Knaus returned, the team resumed its march toward the championship with barely a hiccup. But the episode left a mark on the public perception of the team, reinforcing the narrative that Johnson's success was the product of a crew chief who was willing to bend the rules, rather than a driver who was simply better than everyone else. This perception was unfair, but it was persistent. The reality was that every top team in the Cup Series operated in the grey areas of the rulebook. The rules in NASCAR were complex, detailed, and subject to interpretation, and the crew chiefs who won championships were, almost without exception, the crew chiefs who found ways to extract competitive advantages from the ambiguities and the margins of the regulations. Knaus was more aggressive than most, and he was caught more often than most. But the fundamental approach was not unique to the 48 team. It was a feature of the sport's competitive culture, a culture in which the line between innovation and violation was often blurry and always contested. The 2008 championship, the third in the streak, was won in circumstances that tested Johnson's resilience and Knaus's ingenuity. The competition that season was fierce, with Carl Edwards emerging as the primary challenger. Edwards won 9 races that season, more than Johnson's 7, and led the point standings for much of the year. The battle between the two drivers was one of the most compelling championship duels of the chase era, with the lead changing hands multiple times during the final 10 races. Johnson's ability to win that championship against Edwards was a testament to the qualities that made him unique among the drivers of his generation. Edwards was faster on many weekends. Edwards won more races, but Johnson was more consistent, more disciplined, more capable of extracting the maximum points from every race, regardless of whether the car was capable of winning. The championship came down to the final race at Homestead, Miami, where Johnson's performance was strong enough to secure the title by a margin of 69 points. It was not a dominant margin, but it was a decisive one, earned through the accumulation of strong finishes over the course of the entire chase. The 4th championship in 2009 brought a new set of challenges. Mark Martin, the veteran driver who had been a fixture in the Cup Series for more than 2 decades, emerged as the primary challenger, and the spectacle of a driver in his 50s battling for the championship against a driver in his mid-30s captured the imagination of the sport's fan base. Martin's challenge was emotional and compelling, the story of an aging warrior making one last run at the title that had eluded him throughout his long and distinguished career. Many fans openly rooted for Martin, hoping to see the veteran crowned champion in what might have been his final realistic opportunity. Johnson, characteristically, did not take the bait. He did not engage in the emotional narrative. He did not respond to the fans who booed him for standing between Martin and the title. He simply raced. He finished in the top 5 in 7 of the 10 chase races. He won at Charlotte and at Martinsville, 2 of the most demanding tracks on the schedule, and when the final race was complete, he had won his 4th consecutive championship by a margin of 141 points, the largest winning margin of the streak. The 5th championship in 2010 was the crowning achievement. By this point, the sporting world had begun to take notice of what Johnson was accomplishing. The comparisons to other sports dynasties were being drawn. The New York Yankees of the late 1920s, the Boston Celtics of the late 1950s and early 1960s, the UCLA Bruins basketball program under John Wooden, These were the analogies that journalists and commentators reached for when trying to contextualize a 5-year championship streak in a sport with more than 40 competitors and a format specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of dominance. The 2010 season was not Johnson's most statistically impressive. He won 6 races, the fewest of the 5 championship seasons. He did not dominate the regular season in the way he had in previous years. But his chase performance was exemplary. He won at Charlotte, his second consecutive chase victory at that track. He finished in the top 5 in 6 of the 10 chase races, and he managed the points battle with a poise and an intelligence that reflected the experience of a driver who had been through the championship gauntlet 4 times before and knew exactly what was required. The final race at Homestead, Miami, on November the 21st, 2010, was the culmination of 5 years of sustained excellence. Johnson did not need to win the race to clinch the championship. He needed only to finish respectably, to manage the situation, to avoid the kind of disaster that could have erased the points lead he had built over the previous 9 races. He did more than that. He ran at the front of the field for much of the race, finishing second and securing the 5th consecutive title with a margin of 39 points over Denny Hamlin. The celebration, when it came, was more emotional than any of the previous 4. Johnson, who had maintained his composure through years of unprecedented success, allowed himself a moment of genuine, unguarded joy. The tears that filled his eyes as he climbed from the car were not the tears of a man who had merely won another championship. They were the tears of a man who understood, fully and deeply, the magnitude of what he had just accomplished. 5 in a row. It was done, and it might never be done again. The years that followed the 5-year streak were a different chapter in Johnson's career. He won 2 more championships, in 2013 and 2016, bringing his career total to 7 and tying him with Richard Petty and Dale Earnhardt for the most in the history of the sport. The 7th championship was particularly poignant, earned at the age of 41 in a season that had required Johnson to overcome adversity and inconsistency that would not have been tolerated during the peak years of the streak. But the later years were also marked by a gradual decline that was painful to witness for those who had followed Johnson's career from the beginning. The wins became less frequent. The championship contention became less certain. The number 48 car, which had been a fixture at the front of the field for more than a decade, began to drift back into the middle of the pack with increasing regularity. The sport had changed, the cars had changed, the competition had changed, and Johnson, for all of his talent and experience, could not hold back the relentless tide of time and evolution. The partnership with Chad Knaus, which had been the bedrock of Johnson's success, came to an end after the 2018 season. Knaus was reassigned within the Hendrick organization, and Johnson worked with new crew chiefs during his final 2 seasons. The results were disappointing. Johnson did not win a single race in either 2019 or 2020, a stark contrast to the years when victories had come with assembly line regularity. The man who had won 5 straight championships was now struggling to finish in the top 10, and the gap between the past and the present was a source of both frustration and melancholy. Johnson's final Cup Series race came on November the 8th, 2020, at the season finale at Phoenix Raceway. The race was conducted without fans in attendance due to the global health situation, a surreal circumstance that added an eerie quality to the proceedings. Johnson finished 5th, a respectable result that provided a more dignified conclusion to his Cup Series career than his recent form might have suggested. But the empty grandstands and the quiet paddock were a far cry from the packed stadiums and the roaring crowds that had accompanied his championship celebrations. After leaving NASCAR, Johnson pursued opportunities in other forms of racing, competing in the IndyCar Series in 2021 and 2022, fulfilling a long-held desire to test himself in open-wheel competition. He also competed in selected sports car events, including the prestigious 24 Hours of Le Mans. These post-NASCAR ventures demonstrated the same qualities that had defined his stock car career: the curiosity, the competitive drive, the willingness to push himself beyond his comfort zone, and the humility to accept the challenges and the setbacks that come with competing in unfamiliar disciplines. But the defining achievement of Jimmie Johnson's career will always be the 5 consecutive championships. Everything else, the 7 titles, the 83 victories, the IndyCar experiment, the endurance racing, all of it exists in the shadow of that extraordinary 5-year stretch when one man and one team elevated the sport to a standard of excellence that had never been reached before and may never be reached again. The Daytona 500 victories that bookended Johnson's career at the sport's most prestigious event deserve detailed examination. His first Daytona 500 victory came in 2006, the same year he won his first championship. The race was significant not just for the result, but for the manner in which it was achieved. Daytona, with its restrictor plate racing and its pack dynamics, is a different kind of challenge from the intermediate ovals where Johnson was most dominant. At Daytona, strategy, positioning and drafting partnerships matter as much as raw speed, and the ability to read the draft, to anticipate the moves of the cars around you, and to be in the right place at the right moment is the difference between winning and being swept up in the kind of multi-car crash that is an ever-present danger at superspeedway racing. Johnson demonstrated exceptional pack racing instincts at Daytona, navigating the treacherous dynamics of the restrictor plate field with a confidence and a precision that belied his relative inexperience at the track. His ability to find drafting partners, to position himself near the front of the field when it mattered most, and to make the critical move on the final laps demonstrated a racecraft that went beyond the methodical consistency for which he was best known. At Daytona, Johnson showed that he could also be bold, that he could make the aggressive, decisive moves that superspeedway racing demanded, and that he could do so while maintaining the situational awareness that kept him out of the crashes that eliminated many of his competitors. His second Daytona 500 victory came in 2013, a race that will be remembered for its spectacular final lap crash that collected many of the frontrunners. Johnson, who had positioned himself near the front of the field, but not in the most vulnerable positions, avoided the wreckage and drove through the debris to take the checkered flag. The victory was a blend of skill and fortune, as all Daytona victories are, but it was also a testament to the race management abilities that Johnson and Knaus had refined over more than a decade of competition. They understood the rhythms of the restrictor plate races, they understood the risks, and they understood that surviving to the finish was, at Daytona, at least as important as being the fastest car on the track. The Martinsville victories were another thread in the fabric of Johnson's career that revealed a different dimension of his abilities. Martinsville Speedway, the flat half-mile oval in the mountains of Virginia, is the oldest and the slowest track on the Cup Series schedule. Races at Martinsville are grinding, physical affairs, 500 laps of close-quarters combat on a track where passing is difficult and patience is essential. The brakes take a beating that they take at no other track, with drivers using them hard into every corner for the full duration of the race. The racing surface is abrasive and unforgiving, chewing through tires and testing the limits of the driver's endurance. Johnson won 9 times at Martinsville over the course of his career, making it one of his most successful tracks. The victories at Martinsville demonstrated that Johnson's skills were not limited to the intermediate ovals, where his car's aerodynamic advantage was most pronounced. He could win at a track where the outcome depended less on the car's straight-line speed, and more on the driver's ability to manage the brakes, navigate traffic, and maintain concentration over a brutally long and physically punishing race. The Martinsville victories were blue-collar wins earned through patience and physicality, rather than through the kind of technological dominance that characterized his performances at tracks like Charlotte and Las Vegas. Dover International Speedway, the concrete mile oval known as the Monster Mile, was another track where Johnson's talents were on full display. He won 11 times at Dover, more than at any other track on the schedule. The high-banked, high-speed surface of Dover placed enormous stress on the cars and the drivers, combining the aerodynamic sensitivity of a superspeedway with the physical demands of a short track. Races at Dover were tests of endurance and adaptability, and Johnson's ability to win there repeatedly demonstrated the breadth of his skill set. The Charlotte Motor Speedway victories carried particular significance because Charlotte was the home track for Hendrick Motorsports, the track where the team's performance was scrutinized most closely by the local media and the team's corporate sponsors. Johnson won 8 times at Charlotte, including multiple chase victories that were critical to his championship campaigns. The Charlotte wins were showcases for the entire Hendrick operation, demonstrations of the team's ability to produce a car that was fast enough to win at the track that mattered most to the organization. The Bristol Motor Speedway victories added yet another dimension to the Johnson resume. Bristol, the half-mile concrete bowl in Tennessee, is one of the most physically demanding and emotionally intense tracks on the schedule. The steep banking, the narrow racing surface, and the close proximity of the walls create a racing environment that is equal parts exhilarating and terrifying. Contact between cars is not just common at Bristol, it is expected. The ability to drive aggressively without losing control, to absorb contact without losing composure, and to maintain competitive position through 500 laps of grinding, bumper-to-bumper competition is a test that not every driver is equipped to pass. Johnson's victories at Bristol proved that his skills extended into this demanding environment as well. He was not a naturally aggressive driver in the mold of Dale Earnhardt or Kyle Busch, men who relished the physical combat of short-track racing. But he was tough enough and skilled enough to compete at Bristol without compromising the disciplined, consistent approach that was his trademark. The Bristol victories demonstrated that Johnson's consistency was not the product of caution or passivity. It was the product of controlled aggression, of a driving style that pushed the limits without exceeding them, that took what the track offered without demanding more than the car or the driver could deliver. The chase race victories were the most important wins of Johnson's career, not because they were the most dramatic, but because they were the most consequential. Every chase victory carried double weight, providing not just the points associated with winning a race, but also the psychological momentum that came from demonstrating championship-level performance during the playoff. When the stakes were highest, Johnson won 24 chase races over the course of his career, more than any other driver in the history of the format. This number is perhaps the single most telling statistic in his entire career, because it measures performance in exactly the context where performance mattered most, under the pressure of the championship playoff, against the best drivers in the sport, with everything on the line. The ability to elevate his performance in the chase was one of the most distinctive aspects of Johnson's competitive character. Many drivers performed worse in the chase than they did during the regular season, weighed down by the pressure of the championship battle and the heightened scrutiny that came with competing for the title. Johnson was the opposite. He performed better in the chase than during the regular season, as if the increased pressure sharpened his focus and elevated his game rather than diminishing it. This ability to rise to the occasion, to perform at his best when the stakes were highest, was the hallmark of a true champion, and it was the quality that, more than any other, explained the 5 consecutive titles. The relationship with Lowe's, the home improvement retailer that served as the primary sponsor of Johnson's car for the majority of his career, was one of the most enduring and most successful sponsorship partnerships in the history of the sport. Lowe's entered the partnership before Johnson had won a single Cup Series race and remained with the team through all 7 championships, investing hundreds of millions of dollars in the sponsorship over a period that exceeded a decade and a half. The longevity of the partnership was a testament to the return on investment that Lowe's received from its association with Johnson and the number 48 team, and it was also a reflection of the alignment between the brand's values and the driver's personality. Johnson's professionalism, his reliability, and his consistent excellence mirrored the qualities that Lowe's wanted to associate with its brand, and the partnership was, in every respect, mutually beneficial. The Hendrick Motorsports organization as a whole played a crucial role in Johnson's success that cannot be overstated. Hendrick provided the infrastructure the engineering talent, the financial resources, and the organizational culture that allowed Johnson and Knaus to operate at the highest level. The team's investment in research and development, in simulation technology, in engine performance, and in pit crew training created a platform of competitive excellence that supported not just the number 48 car, but the entire multi-car operation. Johnson benefited from being part of a team that included Jeff Gordon, Dale Earnhardt Jr., and Casey Kahn, drivers whose data and setup information could be shared across the organization, creating a collaborative advantage that single-car teams could not match. Rick Hendrick's leadership of the organization was the invisible foundation upon which all of the team's success was built. Hendrick had the vision to assemble the talent, the wisdom to give that talent the freedom to operate, and the resources to fund the pursuit of excellence at every level of the operation. His relationship with Johnson was one of mutual respect and genuine affection, and the trust between owner and driver allowed the 48 team to operate with an autonomy and a confidence that was essential to its success. The competitive landscape against which Johnson's achievements were measured included some of the most talented drivers in the history of the sport. During the years of the 5 consecutive championships, Johnson competed against Jeff Gordon, who was still winning races and contending for titles. He competed against Tony Stewart, the aggressive, outspoken driver who would win 2 championships of his own. He competed against Carl Edwards, Denny Hamlin, Kyle Busch, Kurt Busch, Matt Kenseth, Greg Biffle, Kevin Harvick, and a host of other talented, well-funded competitors who were determined to prevent the 48 team from adding another trophy to its collection. The depth of the competition during this period made Johnson's dominance all the more remarkable, because it was achieved not against a weak field, but against a field that was, by any historical measure, among the deepest and most talented in the sport's history. The departure of Jeff Gordon from competition after the 2015 season removed one of the key reference points against which Johnson's career had been measured. Gordon had been Johnson's mentor, his teammate, and his most significant intra-team rival for more than a decade. The two men had pushed each other to higher levels of performance, their internal competition sharpening both drivers and elevating the entire Hendrick organization. With Gordon gone, Johnson became the senior statesman of the team, the experienced voice in the drivers' meetings and the veteran presence in the garage area. The role was a natural one for a man who had always been respected by his peers, but it also came with the inevitable implication that the end of his own career was approaching. The 2016 championship, Johnson's 7th and final title, was achieved in circumstances that made it particularly memorable. The season had not been one of his strongest. He won 5 races during the regular season, a respectable total, but not the kind of dominant performance that had characterized his peak years. The chase, conducted under the elimination format, required Johnson to navigate a gauntlet of high-pressure races in which a single poor result could end his championship hopes. He survived each round, advancing to the Championship 4 finale at Homestead Miami Speedway, where he competed against Kyle Busch, Joey Logano, and Carl Edwards for the title. The Homestead race was one of the most dramatic championship finales in the history of the sport. Edwards, running near the front of the field and in position to win the championship, was involved in a late race incident that damaged his car and dropped him out of contention. Johnson, who had been running solidly in the top 5 for most of the race, took advantage of the opportunity and drove to the victory, crossing the finish line first and clinching his 7th championship in the same motion. The emotion on his face as he climbed from the car was visible even through the helmet. 7 championships, tied with Petty and Earnhardt. The record that many had thought was unreachable had been reached. The moment was bittersweet in ways that went beyond the immediate competition. Johnson understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the 7th title might be his last. The sport was changing. The cars were changing. The competition was intensifying. And the physical demands of driving a stock car at the highest level were becoming more difficult to meet as the years accumulated. The celebration at Homestead was genuine, joyful, and deeply emotional. But beneath the joy was the quiet recognition that the extraordinary run was nearing its end. The final 4 seasons of Johnson's Cup Series career, from 2017 through 2020, were a gradual retreat from the standards of excellence he had established. The wins stopped coming. The top 5 finishes became less frequent. The gap between the 48 car and the leaders of the field widened with each passing season. Johnson competed with the same dedication and the same professionalism that had always characterized his approach, but the results no longer matched the effort. The sport had evolved, and the specific combination of skills and circumstances that had made Johnson dominant was no longer sufficient to produce championships. The 2019 and 2020 seasons, his final 2 in the Cup Series, were particularly difficult. Johnson went winless in both seasons, the first time in his career that he had failed to win a race in consecutive years. The drought was a source of frustration and disappointment, but Johnson handled it with the same grace and composure that had defined his response to every challenge he had faced. He did not complain. He did not make excuses. He did not lash out at his crew or his equipment or the sanctioning body. He accepted the reality of the situation and continued to compete with full commitment, honoring the sport and the fans with his effort even as the results no longer reflected his ability. The decision to explore IndyCar racing after retiring from NASCAR was characteristic of Johnson's competitive spirit and his intellectual curiosity. He competed in the IndyCar Series in 2021 and 2022, initially focusing on road and street courses before expanding to include oval events. The transition was humbling. IndyCar racing demands a different skill set from stock car racing, with lighter, more aerodynamically sensitive cars that require a driving technique built around precision braking and corner speed, rather than the mass management and tyre conservation that characterize oval stock car racing. Johnson struggled on the road and street courses, finishing well behind the leaders in most of his starts. But he showed improvement over time, and his oval performances were more competitive, reflecting the transferable skills from his 2 decades in stock cars. The IndyCar experiment was not about winning championships or adding to his legacy. It was about challenging himself, about testing the boundaries of his ability in a new and unfamiliar environment, and about satisfying the same curiosity and competitive drive that had carried him from the dirt bikes of El Cajon to the summit of NASCAR. The endurance racing ventures added yet another dimension to Johnson's post-NASCAR career. He competed in the 24 Hours of Le Mans, the most prestigious endurance race in the world, partnering with established sports car drivers in machinery that was dramatically different from anything he had raced before. The Le Mans experience was another example of Johnson's willingness to push beyond his comfort zone, to seek out challenges that tested not just his speed, but his adaptability, his endurance, and his capacity for learning. Through all of these post-NASCAR adventures, the defining achievement of Johnson's career remained the 5 consecutive championships. It was the accomplishment that set him apart from every other driver in the history of the sport. It was the accomplishment that provoked the most debate, the most analysis, and the most passionate disagreement among fans and experts. And it was the accomplishment that, when all of the noise and the controversy and the arguments about equipment and crew chiefs and rule formats had faded, stood as the most impressive sustained run of excellence in the history of American motorsport. The statistical profile of the 5-year streak bears one final examination, because the numbers, when laid out in their full detail, tell a story that no narrative can fully capture. In 2006, Johnson won 5 races, finished in the top 5 18 times, and in the top 10 24 times out of 36 starts. In 2007, he won 10 races, finished in the top 5 20 times, and in the top 10 24 times. In 2008, he won 7 races, finished in the top 5 22 times, and in the top 10 24 times. In 2009, he won 7 races, finished in the top 5 21 times, and in the top 10 28 times. In 2010, he won 6 races, finished in the top 5 20 times, and in the top 10 24 times. The consistency across those 5 seasons is staggering. Johnson never won fewer than 5 races or more than 10. He finished in the top 5 between 18 and 22 times every season. He finished in the top 10 between 24 and 28 times every season. The variance was minimal. The standard of performance was, season after season, essentially the same. He had found a level, a sustainable plateau of excellence that was high enough to win the championship every year and consistent enough to maintain year after year without significant decline. No other driver in the history of the sport has demonstrated this kind of sustained consistency across 5 consecutive seasons. Individual seasons of comparable quality have been achieved by other drivers. Richard Petty's 1967 season, with its 27 victories, was statistically more dominant than any single Johnson season. Jeff Gordon's 1998 campaign, with 13 wins, was more prolific, but neither Petty nor Gordon maintained that level of performance for 5 consecutive years. The peak was higher, but the duration was shorter. Johnson's peak was slightly lower, but it extended for half a decade, an unbroken plateau of championship-level performance that had no precedent in the sport's history. This is the definitive argument for Jimmie Johnson's greatness. Not any single race, not any single season, not any single moment of brilliance or audacity, but the totality, the sheer mass of accumulated excellence that 5 consecutive championships represent. It is the kind of achievement that grows in stature with the passage of time, as the difficulty of what was accomplished becomes clearer and the impossibility of replicating it becomes more apparent. No one has done it since. The format has changed, the competition has evolved, and the specific alignment of driver, crew chief, team, and competitive environment that produced the streak has never been replicated. The 5 consecutive championships are not just a record, they are a monument, standing in the landscape of American motorsport history, like a mountain that subsequent generations of drivers can admire, aspire to, and ultimately acknowledge as beyond their reach. The deeper truth about Jimmie Johnson is that he was the greatest champion the sport never fully celebrated, and the reason the sport never fully celebrated him reveals something uncomfortable about the nature of fandom, the psychology of spectacle, and the strange relationship between excellence and entertainment. Let that sink in. A man wins 5 consecutive championships in the most competitive era of the sport's history, ties the all-time record with 7 titles, wins 83 races, and accumulates a statistical record that places him alongside the greatest drivers who have ever lived. And the dominant conversation about his career is not about his greatness. It is about whether his greatness was real, whether it counted, whether it was really him or really his crew chief, whether the era in which he competed was somehow less valid than the eras that preceded it, whether the chase format artificially elevated his consistency at the expense of the more dramatic, win-at-all-costs style that the fans preferred. This is the paradox of Jimmie Johnson. His excellence was so thorough, so complete, so devoid of drama that it became, in the eyes of many fans, boring. He did not crash spectacularly. He did not feud publicly with his rivals. He did not drive with the wild, take-no-prisoners aggression that had characterized Dale Earnhardt, or the electrifying speed that had defined Jeff Gordon's peak years. He did not have a personality that generated headlines or a backstory that lent itself to compelling narratives of struggle and redemption. He was, by his own admission, a quiet guy from California who loved to surf and ride bikes and spend time with his family. He was not interesting in the way that the media and the fans defined interesting. He was merely extraordinary. The fan response to Johnson's dominance was at times actively hostile. During the peak years of the streak, Johnson was regularly booed at tracks across the country. The boos were not the affectionate, half-hearted boos that a dominant team sometimes receives from rival fans. They were genuine expressions of frustration, the sound of a fan base that was tired of seeing the same man win year after year, and that resented the way his success was reducing the championship race to a foregone conclusion. Some fans wore shirts that read "Anyone but the 48." Others openly rooted for Johnson to be involved in incidents that would disrupt his championship chances. The hostility was real, and it was rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of what Johnson was accomplishing. The misunderstanding was this: many fans equated excitement with greatness, And because Johnson's particular form of greatness was not exciting in the conventional sense, they dismissed it or diminished it. They wanted the championship to be decided by a last-lap pass, a dramatic crash, a heated confrontation. They wanted the narrative to be unpredictable and emotionally charged. What they got instead was a masterclass in the art of consistency, a driver who managed the championship the way a chess grandmaster manages a game, always thinking several moves ahead, always minimizing risk, always placing himself in a position where the mathematics of the point system worked in his favor. It was brilliant, it was historically unprecedented, and it was, for many fans, profoundly unsatisfying. The role of Chad Knaus in the narrative was both a blessing and a burden for Johnson. Knaus's brilliance as a crew chief was undeniable. His ability to prepare a car that was consistently fast, week after week, track after track, was unmatched in the sport. His strategic acumen during races, his decisions about pit timing, tyre management, and fuel strategy was consistently among the best in the field. But Knaus's prominence in the team's success story created a perception that Johnson was merely the fortunate beneficiary of a great crew chief, a driver who happened to be in the right seat at the right time. This perception was deeply unfair. The reality, understood by everyone who worked in the garage area and many who analyzed the sport professionally, was that Jimmie Johnson was an exceptionally talented driver whose skills behind the wheel were essential to the team's success. A great crew chief can prepare a fast car, but the crew chief does not drive the car. The crew chief does not make the split-second decisions in traffic at 200 miles per hour. The crew chief does not feel the tyres losing grip as they degrade over a fuel run. The crew chief does not manage the delicate balance between aggression and patience that determines whether a driver finishes 3rd or 13th. Those are the driver's responsibilities, and Johnson executed them with a mastery that was evident to anyone who watched closely enough. The fitness dimension of Johnson's career was another aspect that set him apart from his contemporaries, and that deserves deeper examination. Johnson was, by the standards of his era, a physical specimen. He was lean, muscular, and possessed of an endurance capacity that rivaled that of professional endurance athletes. He trained obsessively, following rigorous fitness regimens that included running, cycling, swimming, and strength training. He competed in triathlons, marathons, and cycling events during the off-season, not as publicity exercises, but as genuine competitive pursuits that he approached with the same intensity he brought to racing. This commitment to physical fitness was not merely a personal preference, it was a competitive advantage. Stock car racing is one of the most physically demanding sports in the world. The combination of heat, vibration, G-forces, and sustained mental concentration that a driver experiences during a 500-mile race places enormous stress on the body. A driver who is not in peak physical condition will fatigue faster, make more mistakes, and lose performance over the course of a long race. Johnson's superior fitness allowed him to maintain his concentration and his physical performance deep into races when other drivers were beginning to fade, and this advantage compounded over the course of a 36-race season. The fitness revolution that Johnson helped spark in NASCAR was one of his less recognized but more significant contributions to the sport. Before Johnson, physical fitness was not a priority for most Cup Series drivers. Many drivers maintained minimal training regimens, relying on their natural endurance and their familiarity with the demands of the cockpit to get them through races. Johnson's success changed that calculation. When other drivers and teams saw the advantage that Johnson's fitness provided, they began investing in their own training programs. The result was a broad elevation in the physical conditioning of the driver field, a change that made the sport safer and more competitive. Let that sink in. The most underappreciated champion in the sport's history was also, arguably, the most physically prepared. He brought a level of athletic commitment to stock car racing that raised the standard for the entire field, and he did it quietly, without fanfare, without seeking credit, simply because he believed it was the right way to prepare for competition. The personal life that Johnson built during his championship years reveals a dimension of his character that the public saw only in glimpses. He married Chandra Janway in 2004, and together they had two daughters, Genevieve Marie and Lydia Norris. Johnson was, by all accounts, a devoted husband and father, a man who found genuine fulfillment in the daily rhythms of family life, and who worked consciously to maintain a balance between the demands of his career and the needs of his family. The balance was not always easy to achieve. The NASCAR schedule is brutal, requiring drivers to be on the road for much of the year, traveling from track to track in a cycle of preparation, competition, and recovery that leaves little time for the routines and the rituals that sustain a family. Johnson managed this challenge by involving his family in his racing life whenever possible, bringing Chandra and the girls to the track, creating a sense of shared experience that connected his professional world to his personal one. The relationship between Johnson and Jeff Gordon, which had begun as a mentorship and evolved into a deep and genuine friendship, was another defining element of Johnson's personal world. Gordon had recommended Johnson to Rick Hendrick. Gordon had provided guidance and support during the early years of Johnson's career, and Gordon had watched with a complicated mix of pride and competitive frustration as his protégé surpassed him in the championship standings and established himself as the most dominant driver of his generation. The fact that their friendships survived the competitive pressure that could have destroyed it is a testament to the character of both men. The broader significance of Johnson's career within the context of NASCAR's evolution is a topic that deserves more attention than it has typically received. Johnson competed during a period of enormous change in the sport. The chase format was introduced and then modified multiple times during his career. The cars underwent multiple redesigns, from the traditional stock car templates of the early 2000s to the car of tomorrow in 2007 to the Generation 6 car in 2013. The sponsorship landscape shifted dramatically, with traditional sponsors departing and new categories of partners entering the sport. The television contracts were renegotiated. The track schedule was reconfigured. The driver roster turned over almost entirely. Through all of these changes, Johnson remained a constant. He adapted to every new car, every new rule, every new competitive dynamic. He competed successfully under the original chase format, the modified chase format, and the elimination-style playoff format that replaced it. He won championships with different iterations of the car, on different configurations of the schedule, against different generations of competitors. This adaptability was one of his most underrated qualities, a reflection of the same instinct for reading and responding to changing conditions that he had developed as an off-road racer in the California desert. The question of Johnson's place in the all-time hierarchy of NASCAR drivers is one that generates more debate than perhaps any other question in the sport. The statistical case for placing him at the very top is strong. 7 championships, tied for the most in history, 83 victories, placing him 6th on the all-time list. The 5 consecutive championships that no one else has achieved. The sustained period of dominance from 2002 through 2016 that produced all of those championships and the majority of those victories. By the numbers, Jimmie Johnson's career is comparable to any in the sport's history and superior to most. But the debate is not purely statistical. It is also subjective, shaped by questions of era, context, personality, and the intangible qualities that separate the merely great from the truly legendary. Richard Petty won 200 races and defined the sport for a generation. Dale Earnhardt won 7 championships and became the most compelling personality in the sport's history. Jeff Gordon won 4 titles and transformed the sport's identity and its audience. David Pearson, Cale Yarborough, Darrell Waltrip. Each of these drivers brought something to the sport that went beyond statistics, a personality, a style, a cultural significance that made them larger than their records. Johnson's contribution was different. It was quieter, more methodical, less dramatic, but it was no less significant. He proved that sustained excellence, the ability to perform at the highest level year after year over a period of more than a decade, was the ultimate test of a champion. He proved that the most important quality in a champion was not the ability to have one great season or one great race, but the ability to maintain a standard of performance that was consistently among the best in the field, regardless of the changes in equipment, in rules, in competition, or in the physical and mental demands of a long career. He proved that consistency was not the opposite of greatness. It was the highest expression of it. The truth that emerges from a careful examination of Jimmie Johnson's career is that the sport's failure to fully celebrate his achievement says more about the sport and its fans than it does about the man himself. Johnson did everything that a champion is supposed to do. He won races, he won championships, he set records, he competed with integrity and conducted himself with class. He treated his competitors, his team, and his fans with respect. He never complained about the lack of recognition. He never demanded attention. He simply did his job, week after week, year after year, with a level of excellence that the sport had never seen before. The fact that this was not enough to make him the most popular or the most celebrated driver of his era is a reflection of the complicated relationship that sports fans have with the concept of greatness. Fans want drama, they want conflict, they want emotion, they want the story to be exciting, not just impressive. And Jimmie Johnson, for all of his extraordinary accomplishments, never gave the fans the drama they craved. He gave them something rarer and more valuable. He gave them perfection. And perfection, it turns out, is not always what people want to watch. The comparison to other sports dynasties illuminates the magnitude of what Johnson accomplished. In professional basketball, the Boston Celtics won 8 consecutive championships from 1959 through 1966, but they competed in a league with far fewer teams and far less competitive balance than the modern Cup Series. In professional baseball, the New York Yankees won 5 consecutive World Series from 1949 through 1953, an achievement that is still regarded as one of the most impressive in American sports history. But the Yankees, like the Celtics, competed in an era of limited competition, with a fraction of the teams and the depth of talent that characterize modern professional sport. Johnson's 5 consecutive championships were achieved in a league with more than 40 entrants per race, governed by rules designed to promote competitive balance and conducted under a playoff format specifically intended to prevent sustained dominance. The difficulty of what he accomplished, measured against the conditions under which he accomplished it, is arguably greater than any sustained championship run in the history of American team sports. The silence that greeted this comparison in the broader sports media was itself revealing. Johnson's streak was covered, certainly. It was noted. It was occasionally discussed in terms that acknowledged its significance. But it never generated the kind of sustained, passionate debate that accompanies the great achievements in more mainstream sports. When a baseball player approaches a home run record, the entire nation watches. When a basketball team threatens a win streak, the coverage is wall to wall. When Jimmie Johnson won his 5th consecutive championship, the reaction, even among sports fans who did not follow NASCAR, was muted. The achievement was too great for the audience it reached, too significant for the platform on which it occurred. It was one of the greatest sustained performances in the history of American sport, and it was, to a large degree, invisible to the broader sporting public. This invisibility was not Johnson's fault. It was the product of NASCAR's position within the American sports hierarchy, a position that, despite the sport's enormous popularity within its core audience, has never achieved the mainstream cultural centrality of baseball, football, or basketball. The sport's regional identity, its working-class associations, and its perceived cultural distance from the mainstream sports media have historically limited its ability to break through to the broader public consciousness. And Johnson's achievements, however extraordinary, were constrained by these same limitations. The irony is sharp. Johnson's career was, in many ways, the most accessible version of NASCAR greatness that the sport had ever produced. He was not a Southerner steeped in the sport's regional traditions. He was a Californian who had come to the sport from outside its traditional pipeline. He was articulate, photogenic, and comfortable in settings that extended well beyond the motorsport world. He was, in theory, the perfect ambassador for a sport that was seeking to expand its national audience. And yet the broader audience never fully embraced him, not because of anything he did or failed to do, but because the culture in which he competed remained, despite decades of growth and expansion, fundamentally different from the culture of mainstream American sport. The personal toll of the championship years is another dimension of the deeper truth that deserves exploration. The physical demands of competing at the Cup Series level for 2 decades have already been described, but the emotional and psychological demands were equally significant. The pressure of championship competition, sustained over 5 consecutive seasons, was an invisible weight that Johnson carried with him at every moment. The expectations of his team, his sponsors, his family, and the sporting public created a constant state of heightened awareness that was both energizing and exhausting. Johnson managed this pressure through a combination of mental discipline, physical fitness, and a support network that included his wife Chandra, his friends and family, and a small group of trusted advisors who helped him navigate the demands of his extraordinary career. He was intentional about his mental health, practicing mindfulness and meditation techniques that helped him maintain his emotional equilibrium during the most intense periods of championship competition. He was equally intentional about his relationships, prioritizing time with his wife and daughters, and maintaining friendships outside the racing world that provided perspective and grounding. The balance that Johnson achieved between his professional and personal lives was one of the most admirable aspects of his character. Many elite athletes, consumed by the demands of their careers and the pressures of public life, struggle to maintain healthy relationships and a stable home life. Johnson, by contrast, appeared to have found a sustainable equilibrium, a way of being fully committed to his career while also being fully present in his personal life. This balance was not accidental. It was the product of deliberate effort and conscious choice, a recognition that excellence on the track meant nothing if it came at the cost of the relationships and the experiences that gave life its meaning. The legacy of the Johnson-Knaus partnership extends beyond the record books and into the operational culture of the sport. The standards of preparation, the emphasis on data-driven decision-making, the professionalization of pit crew performance, and the integration of physical fitness into the competitive equation are all areas in which Johnson and Knaus helped establish new benchmarks for the sport. The teams that compete in the Cup Series today operate at a level of sophistication that would have been unrecognizable to the teams of even the 1990s, and the Johnson-Knaus partnership was one of the primary catalysts for this transformation. The contrast between the way Johnson competed and the way the sport celebrated him remains the central tension of his story. He was the greatest sustained champion the sport had ever produced, and the sport never quite figured out what to do with him. He was the answer to the question of what would happen if a driver optimized every aspect of his performance, from the car to the crew to his own physical and mental preparation, and maintained that optimization for the better part of 2 decades. The answer was 5 consecutive championships and 7 total, a record that belongs in the same category as the most impressive sustained performances in the history of any sport. And yet the celebration was muted, the recognition was incomplete. The man who had given the sport its most impressive statistical achievement was never its most beloved or its most celebrated figure. This disconnect, this gap between achievement and recognition, is the final and most revealing truth of Jimmie Johnson's career. It tells us something about the nature of fandom, about the relationship between personality and performance, about the human tendency to value the dramatic over the excellent and the spectacular over the sustainable. It is a truth that extends beyond sport and into the broader human experience, a truth about the way we assign value and allocate attention and construct the narratives through which we understand the world. Jimmie Johnson did not fit the narrative that the sport and its fans wanted to tell. He was not the hero or the villain or the colourful character that makes for a compelling story. He was something rarer and more difficult to categorize. He was the best, simply, quietly, relentlessly the best. And the fact that being the best was not enough to make him the most celebrated is the deeper truth that his career reveals. The charitable work that Johnson undertook through the Jimmie Johnson Foundation was another expression of the values that defined his life beyond the track. The foundation, established in 2006, the same year as his first championship, focused on education initiatives, funding programs that provided resources and support to students in communities across the country. Johnson was actively involved in the foundation's work, not as a distant figurehead, but as a hands-on participant who visited schools, met with educators, and helped shape the organization's strategic direction. The focus on education was a deliberate choice that reflected Johnson's own values and his understanding of the transformative power of learning. He had seen in his own career how preparation and knowledge could create opportunities that talent alone could not. He wanted to extend that principle beyond the world of racing, to give young people the tools and the support they needed to pursue their own paths, whatever those paths might be. The foundation raised millions of dollars over the years, funding hundreds of grants to schools and educational programs, and its impact on the communities it served was tangible and lasting. The surfing was another aspect of Johnson's life that revealed his connection to the California coast where he had grown up, a counterbalance to the relentless intensity of his professional life. The image of Jimmie Johnson, 7-time Cup Series champion, carrying a surfboard across a beach in board shorts and flip-flops, was as authentic a portrait of the man as any Victory Lane photograph. The cycling was perhaps even more central to Johnson's identity during and after his racing career. He became an accomplished amateur cyclist, competing in road races and long-distance events that tested his endurance and his competitive drive in a context that was entirely separate from motorsport. He trained with the same intensity and the same analytical approach that he brought to his racing preparation, tracking his performance data with the meticulous attention to detail that had characterized his entire career. The cycling community embraced him, recognizing a kindred spirit in a man who approached physical challenge with the same dedication and the same humility that they valued in their own pursuit. The triathlon competitions took the physical challenge to yet another level. Johnson competed in half Ironman and full Ironman events, testing himself across 3 disciplines, swimming, cycling and running, in competitions that lasted for hours and demanded a combination of physical fitness, mental toughness and strategic pacing. His triathlon performances were impressive by any standard, and they demonstrated a commitment to physical excellence that extended well beyond what was required for his racing career. For Johnson, the triathlons were not about winning trophies or setting records. They were about the pursuit of personal limits, the satisfaction of pushing his body and his mind to the edge of what was possible, and the quiet joy of discovering that there was always more to give. This commitment to physical challenge was, in its way, a metaphor for Johnson's entire career. He was a man who was never satisfied with what he had already achieved. He was always looking for the next mountain to climb, the next boundary to test, the next level of performance to reach. This restless pursuit of excellence, this refusal to be defined or limited by past accomplishments, was the quality that made him a 7-time champion, and that continues to drive him in the post-racing phase of his life. The deeper truth about Jimmie Johnson is ultimately a truth about the relationship between character and achievement. His character, the quiet determination, the humility, the work ethic, the adaptability, the emotional intelligence shaped the career. And the career, with its unprecedented 5 consecutive championships and its 7 total titles, was the fullest expression of that character. The two are inseparable. The man and the record are one and the same, and to understand either, you must understand both. What does Jimmie Johnson's legacy mean to the sport of NASCAR? The question cannot be answered with a single number or a single statement, because the legacy itself is multifaceted, shaped by achievement and perception in equal measure, and the tension between those two forces gives the legacy its particular character. The competitive record is beyond dispute. 7 Cup Series championships, tied with Richard Petty and Dale Earnhardt for the most in history, 83 career victories, 2 Daytona 500 wins, 11 championship-clinching chase victories, and the 5 consecutive titles, the achievement that belongs to Johnson alone. The feat that no other driver in the history of the sport has accomplished. These numbers are the pillars of the legacy immovable and permanent, and they will stand in the record books for as long as stock car racing exists. But a legacy is more than numbers. A legacy is the impression that a career leaves on the sport and on the people who follow it, and the impression that Jimmie Johnson's career leaves is more complicated, more nuanced, and more interesting than a simple recitation of statistics can convey. Consider the way Johnson changed the sport's understanding of what a championship driver looks like. Before Johnson, the prototype of a NASCAR champion was a larger-than-life personality, a man who commanded attention through the force of his presence as much as through the quality of his driving. Richard Petty had his cowboy hat and his boundless charm. Dale Earnhardt had his intimidating glare and his unapologetic aggression. Jeff Gordon had his boyish good looks and his crossover appeal. These were men who defined the sport as much through who they were as through what they did on the track. They were stars. They were personalities. They were, in the fullest sense of the word, celebrities. Johnson was different. He was not a personality in the traditional sense. He was a competitor, a professional, a man who defined himself through his work rather than through his persona. He did not seek the spotlight. He did not court controversy. He did not cultivate an image designed to maximize his marketability or his media presence. He simply raced with a dedication and a consistency that made the rest of the field look amateurish by comparison, and he left it to the record books to tell his story. This approach was both admirable and costly. Admirable because it reflected a genuine humility, a willingness to let the works speak for itself, rather than amplifying it through self-promotion. Costly because it meant that Johnson's achievements were consistently undervalued by a fan base and a media ecosystem that rewarded personality as much as performance. The lesson of Johnson's career, if there is one, is that the greatest champion is not always the most celebrated champion, and that the relationship between excellence and recognition is more complicated than it should be. There is a philosophical dimension to this observation that extends beyond the world of sport. In every field of human endeavor, the most consistent performers are often the least appreciated. The doctor who never loses a patient does not receive the accolades that go to the surgeon who performs a dramatic, life-saving operation. The teacher whose students consistently score at the top of the class does not receive the recognition that goes to the teacher who rescues a single struggling student from academic failure. Consistency, by its nature, is invisible. It does not generate stories. It does not produce moments that can be packaged into narratives of drama and redemption. It simply exists, quiet and reliable and extraordinary in its ordinariness. And the world, which loves nothing more than a good story, often fails to notice it. Jimmie Johnson's career was a monument to consistency, and the sport's failure to fully appreciate that monument is a reflection of this broader human tendency. The fans wanted a story. They wanted a hero who struggled and overcame. They wanted a villain who was defeated by a noble protagonist. They wanted drama. What they got was a man who showed up every week, prepared better than everyone else, drove better than everyone else, and won more championships than everyone else. The story was there. It was the greatest story the sport had ever produced. But it was not the kind of story that lends itself to easy narrative, and so it was overlooked, undervalued, and taken for granted. The era that Johnson dominated, the 2000s and the early 2010s, was itself a period of transition for the sport. NASCAR had experienced explosive growth in the 1990s and early 2000s, driven by the Earnhardt-Gordon rivalry, the expansion into new markets, and the negotiation of lucrative television contracts. But by the late 2000s, the growth had plateaued and then begun to reverse. Television ratings declined, track attendance dropped, sponsor participation contracted. The sport was facing an identity crisis, struggling to define its place in an entertainment landscape that was becoming increasingly crowded and competitive. Johnson's dominance coincided with this period of decline, and the timing was unfortunate. The fans who were turning away from the sport were not, in most cases, turning away because of Johnson. They were turning away because of broader economic pressures, changes in entertainment consumption patterns, and a feeling that the sport had lost some of the authentic, grassroots character that had made it special. but Johnson's repeated championships became, for some, a convenient symbol of the sport's problems, a stand-in for the perceived blandness and predictability that was driving fans away. It was not fair to Johnson, but it was a reality he had to live with. The transition from driver to elder statesman and then to post-NASCAR competitor revealed new dimensions of Johnson's character. His decision to race in IndyCar, a discipline that demanded entirely different skills from stock car racing, was an act of courage and humility. He was not chasing glory in IndyCar. He was chasing experience, pushing himself beyond the boundaries of the comfort zone he had occupied for 2 decades, testing himself against a new kind of challenge. The results were mixed. He struggled on the road and street courses, which demanded a precision of braking and a knowledge of apex geometry that his stock car background had not fully prepared him for. He performed better on the oval tracks, where his experience and his instincts gave him a foundation to build on. But the willingness to expose himself to a new discipline, to accept the humbling reality of being a midfield runner after years of championship dominance, spoke to a competitive integrity that commanded respect. The broader racing community recognized Johnson's achievement, even when the casual fans did not. His fellow drivers, the men who competed against him week after week, and who understood the difficulty of what he was doing, universally acknowledged him as one of the greatest of all time. Crew chiefs and engineers, the technical specialists who understood the complexity of sustained championship-level performance, recognized the partnership between Johnson and Knaus as one of the most remarkable in the history of the sport. Racing historians, freed from the biases of the present moment, have increasingly placed Johnson alongside Petty and Earnhardt and Gordon in the sport's Mount Rushmore, a recognition that the passage of time is clarifying what the noise of the moment obscured. The Hall of Fame induction in 2024 was the formal affirmation of what the racing world already knew. Jimmie Johnson, the quiet kid from El Cajon, the off-road racer who had stumbled into stock cars almost by accident, the man who had won 5 straight championships and 7 overall, was one of the greatest drivers in the history of American motorsport. The recognition was overdue, but it was welcome, and it provided a moment of reflection for a sport that does not always do a good job of honoring its champions while they are still present to appreciate the honor. The melancholy that accompanies the end of any great career is present in Johnson's story. The declining years, when the victories stopped and the championship contention faded, were difficult to watch for those who remembered the peak years. The empty grandstands at his final Cup Series race, a consequence of circumstances beyond anyone's control, denied him the farewell that his career deserved. The transition from NASCAR to IndyCar, while admirable in its ambition, did not produce the results that would have added a triumphant coda to an extraordinary career. But melancholy is not the dominant note of the Johnson legacy. The dominant note is awe, our way at the scope of the achievement, our way at the consistency of the performance, our at the quiet, unassuming way in which a man from El Cajon, California, rewrote the record books of a sport that had been dominated for decades by legends whose names had become synonymous with greatness itself. Richard Petty, Dale Earnhardt, Jimmie Johnson, the 3 men who share the record for the most championships in the history of NASCAR. The fact that Johnson's name belongs in that company is the ultimate testament to the career he built and the standard he set. The question of how future generations will view Jimmie Johnson's career is one that will be answered by time and perspective. History has a way of correcting the biases and the blind spots of the present, and there is good reason to believe that Johnson's reputation will grow in the decades ahead. The statistics are permanent, the record is immutable, and as the emotional reactions and the cultural prejudices that coloured the contemporary perception of his career fade into the past, what will remain is the achievement itself, clean and clear and beyond dispute. There is a precedent for this kind of retrospective reappraisal in other sports. In professional basketball, Bill Russell was underappreciated during his playing career relative to his more charismatic contemporary Wilt Chamberlain. In the decades since their retirements, Russell's 11 championships have elevated his reputation to a level that Chamberlain's more impressive individual statistics cannot match. The sports world learned, over time, that championships matter more than drama, that sustained excellence matters more than individual brilliance, and that the quiet champion who wins year after year is, in the final accounting, more deserving of recognition than the spectacular performer who wins only occasionally. Jimmie Johnson's story follows a similar trajectory. The contemporaneous reaction to his championships was muted, coloured by complaints about the format, skepticism about his crew chief, and a general sense that his personality was insufficiently compelling for a champion of his stature. But the passage of time will strip away these qualifications and leave behind the essential fact. 5 consecutive championships, 7 total, 83 victories, a career of extraordinary longevity and consistency at the highest level of the sport. These are the facts that history will record, and these are the facts on which his legacy will ultimately be judged. The sport itself has already begun the process of reappraisal. The NASCAR Hall of Fame induction was the most visible expression of this shift, but it was not the only one. The respect that Johnson commands from the current generation of drivers, who grew up watching his championships and who understand, from personal experience, the difficulty of competing at the Cup Series level, is deeper and more widespread than the casual fan might realize. In the garage area, where the opinions of fellow competitors carry more weight than the opinions of anyone outside the sport, Jimmie Johnson is universally regarded as one of the greatest to ever strap into a stock car. That consensus, formed by the people who are most qualified to judge, is perhaps the most authoritative assessment of his career that exists. The melancholy that accompanies any reflection on a career that has ended is present in the Johnson story, as it is in every story of athletic greatness. The races are over. The championships have been won. The numbers are fixed in the record books, permanent and unchangeable. What remains is the memory, the impression, the feeling that a career of this magnitude leaves on the people who witnessed it, and the sport that was its stage. For those who followed Johnson's career closely, who watched the 5 consecutive championships unfold in real time, and who understood the magnitude of what they were witnessing, the feeling is one of quiet awe, the recognition that they were present for one of the greatest sustained performances in the history of American sport. The understanding that what they saw was rare, precious, and unlikely to be repeated in their lifetimes. For the sport of NASCAR, Johnson's legacy is both a source of pride and a challenge. The pride is obvious. The sport produced a champion of historic proportions, a man whose achievement can stand comparison with the greatest sustained performances in any sport. The challenge is equally obvious. The sport failed, during the years of Johnson's dominance, to celebrate that achievement with the enthusiasm and the visibility it deserved. The lesson for the sport and for its fans is that greatness comes in many forms, and that the quiet, consistent, methodical form that Johnson embodied is no less valid, no less impressive, and no less worthy of celebration than the more dramatic forms that have historically captured the public imagination. In the end, the story of Jimmie Johnson is a story about the quiet power of consistency, about the kind of greatness that does not announce itself with thunderclaps and lightning, but arrives steadily, week after week, year after year, until the accumulation of excellence becomes so vast that it can no longer be overlooked. He was not the fastest driver of his generation on any single day. There were drivers who could out-qualify him, who could lead more laps, who could win a race from the front row in dominant fashion. But no one could match him over the course of a season. No one could match him over the course of 5 seasons. No one could sustain the level of performance that Jimmie Johnson sustained, at the highest level of the most competitive form of American motorsport for the better part of 2 decades. That is the truth of Jimmie Johnson. Not a truth of single moments, though there were moments that took the breath away. Not a truth of spectacle, though the spectacle of 5 consecutive championships is as impressive as anything the sport has produced. But a truth of accumulation. A truth that reveals itself not in the highlight reel, but in the full accounting, in the race-by-race, season-by-season ledger of finishes and points and positions that, when tallied at the end, adds up to something that no other driver has ever achieved. 5 consecutive championships. Say it again, because the phrase deserves to be repeated until its full weight is felt. 5 consecutive championships. From 2006 through 2010, Jimmie Johnson was the best driver in the NASCAR Cup Series every single year. Not the most exciting, not the most popular, not the most talked about. The best. And the record books, which care nothing for drama or personality or narrative convenience, confirm this with an authority that no amount of debate can overturn. 7 championships in total, 83 career victories, 2 Daytona 500 wins, more than 2 decades of competition at the highest level. A career that began in the desert hills of Southern California and ended on the ovals and road courses of the world's most demanding racing series. A career that transformed the way the sport thought about preparation, about fitness, about the science of sustained excellence. The partnership with Chad Knaus will be studied and debated for as long as people care about the craft of racing. 2 men, different in temperament but united in their commitment to perfection, who together built a competitive machine that dominated the sport for a decade. The driver who could feel the car's behavior at the molecular level, who could translate his sensations into the precise language of chassis adjustment and tire management, who could execute a race plan with the discipline of a soldier and the artistry of a poet. The crew chief, who could prepare a car that was consistently among the fastest in the field, who could strategize with the analytical precision of a mathematician, who could push the boundaries of the rules without losing sight of the fundamental goal, to put the best car on the track and let the driver do the rest. Together, they were more than the sum of their parts. Together, they were the greatest driver-crew-chief partnership in the modern history of the sport. And together, they produced a body of work that will stand as a benchmark of excellence for generations to come. Jimmie Johnson did not ask to be loved. He did not seek attention. He did not play the game of public perception with the skill or the enthusiasm of some of his contemporaries. He let the racing speak, and the racing spoke with a clarity and a consistency that was in the end more eloquent than any press conference or any social media post could ever be. There is a lesson in the Jimmie Johnson story that extends beyond the world of motorsport. The lesson is that true greatness does not always look the way we expect it to look. It does not always come wrapped in charisma and controversy. It does not always announce itself with dramatic gestures and memorable sound bites. Sometimes true greatness is quiet. Sometimes it is steady. Sometimes it is the man who shows up every day, does his work at the highest possible standard, and goes home without making a fuss. Sometimes the greatest champion is the one we have to look hardest to see, because he does not demand to be seen. He simply demands of himself that he be the best. Jimmie Johnson was the best, for 5 consecutive years, and for much of a career that spanned more than 2 decades, he was the best stock car driver on the planet. The record confirms it. The championships confirm it. The fellow drivers who competed against him and who understood the difficulty of what he was achieving would confirm it. And history, which has a way of correcting the oversights of the present, will confirm it with increasing clarity as the years pass and the noise of the moment fades, and all that remains is the record, clean and permanent and beyond dispute. The cars will keep racing. The championships will keep being won. New champions will emerge, each one adding their name to the ledger of greatness that the sport has been compiling since its founding. The technology will evolve. The rules will change. The tracks will be reconfigured and renovated and replaced. And through all of these changes, the record of Jimmie Johnson will stand, quiet and permanent and undisturbed, a benchmark of excellence that future champions will measure themselves against, and that most, if not all, will find beyond their reach. In a sport defined by noise, by the thundering roar of 40 engines at the green flag, by the scream of tires on asphalt, by the crash of metal against concrete, by the explosive celebration of a victory hard won, Jimmie Johnson was the quiet in the center of the storm. He was the calm eye around which the chaos of competition swirled. He was the steady hand that steered through the turbulence. He was the measured heartbeat in a sport that prized adrenaline above all else, and he won, again and again and again, year after year after year, through changes of crew chief and changes of car and changes of rules, through the prime of his career and into its twilight. Through the cheers and the boos and the studied indifference of fans who could not decide whether to celebrate him or simply accept him as an inevitable force of nature, like gravity or the tides, constant and unremarkable precisely because of its constancy. The man from El Cajon left the sport better than he found it. He left it with a standard of sustained excellence that will endure for as long as stock cars take to the track. He left it with a model of professionalism and dedication that every aspiring driver can study and admire. He left it with a record that needs no embellishment, no narrative enhancement, no dramatic retelling to make it impressive. The numbers speak. They have always spoken, and they will continue to speak clearly and authoritatively, long after the debates about personality and format and crew chiefs have faded into the background noise of history. He came from the desert, he drove to the summit, and he stayed there, calm and focused and relentless, longer than anyone had ever stayed before. Consider the span of it. A boy on a dirt bike in the hills east of San Diego, a teenager in a sprint truck learning to read the chaos of off-road racing, a young man in the Busch Series, catching the eye of a four-time champion who saw something special in the quiet Californian, a rookie in the Cup Series, teaming with a fierce, demanding crew chief who would become his partner in the most dominant run the sport had ever witnessed. A champion at 30, a five-time champion at 35, a seven-time champion at 41, and through it all, from the first race to the last, the same qualities that defined him from the very beginning: the calm, the focus, the refusal to seek attention, and the determination to earn respect. The belief, held quietly and expressed through action rather than words, that the only opinion that truly matters is the one rendered by the scoreboard at the end of the season. 5 in a row, 7 in all, the numbers of a man who was in every way that matters a king among champions. 7 championships, 5 in a row, 83 wins. The numbers of a quiet man who let the record do the talking. They called him Jimmie Johnson. Quiet, consistent, unstoppable, and the record will never be silent.